Welcome to Luke's Stories, where camping isn't all about campfires and stars, but also nightmares in the dark. I should have known better. 50 years as a park ranger taught me one thing. When locals warn you about a place, you listen. But I've never been one to believe in ghost stories. Superstitions were just another thing that came with small-town life, like potluck dinners and neighbors who knew your business. After my wife passed, I sold the house. It felt too empty, too loud with her absence. I hit the road in our old RV, looking for places where the silence wasn't so heavy. That's how I ended up at Dead Man's Hollow in southeastern Ohio, a place with a reputation darker than the coal it used to mine. The name alone should have given me pause. The gas station was the last bit of civilization before the road turned to dirt and the woods swallowed the world. The young guy at the counter was a jittery type, all elbows and sideways glances. "You heading up to the hollow?" he asked as he handed me my change. "Yeah," I replied, tossing the bag of jerky onto the passenger seat. His eyes darted to the parking lot. "You shouldn't go there." "Oh yeah? Why's that?" "People go missing out there, or come back different." He leaned in closer. "My granddad said the land's cursed. Miners died bad back in the day and folks started seeing things." I gave him a polite nod and left. I didn't need a campfire story. I needed peace. The road into Dead Man's Hollow twisted like a snake, the trees crowding so close they nearly blocked out the sun. By the time I reached the old campsite, shadows stretched long across the clearing. It was just me and my RV, alone in the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Perfect. I set up camp and brewed a pot of coffee, the rich smell cutting through the cool evening air. The first night passed quietly, just the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The second night was when the tapping started. It woke me around midnight, a faint, rhythmic sound on the RV window. Tap, tap, tap. I rolled over, groggy and annoyed. At first, I thought it was a branch brushing against the glass, but when I pulled back the curtain, nothing was there, just darkness and the skeletal outlines of trees. The tapping stopped as soon as I looked. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. A narrow trail led from the campsite into the heart of the hollow, winding through dense underbrush. It wasn't long before I came across the ruins of the old mining operation, a rusted winch, crumbling stone walls, and the gaping black maw of a collapsed mine entrance. That's when I saw it, a mining helmet, half buried in the dirt. Its lamp was shattered, and the leather strap had rotted away, but something about it called to me. I brushed off the dirt and slipped it into my pack. As I turned to leave, I felt it. A prickling sensation, like static electricity crawling over my skin. The air grew heavy, the kind of pressure that signals an oncoming storm. I glanced back at the mine, half expecting to see someone watching me. Nothing. By the time I returned to camp, the feeling had passed, but unease lingered like the smell of smoke after a fire. That night, the tapping came back, louder this time. I sat up, every nerve on edge. The sound was steady, deliberate, not the random scratching of a branch or the scampering of an animal. Tap, tap, tap. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped outside. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but empty woods. The night was unnaturally still. No wind, no crickets, not even the hoot of an owl. Then I saw them. Footprints. They circled the RV, leading toward the ruins. My stomach tightened as I crouched to examine them. They were boot prints, wide and deep, as if made by someone dragging heavy equipment. But they weren't fresh. The edges were crumbling, as though the soil had been disturbed long ago. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I told myself I was imagining things. Grief can play tricks on the mind, and I was no stranger to the loneliness that comes with isolation. But when I saw the mining helmet sitting on the table, perfectly cleaned and polished, I knew something was wrong. I hadn't touched it since I found it. The radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. Static hissed from the speakers, rising and falling like waves. Then, faintly, I heard it. Voices. "Mister, help us." The words were garbled, buried beneath the static, but unmistakable. My breath caught as the static turned to a low, guttural moan. The radio clicked off on its own, leaving me in deafening silence. I should have left right then, packed up, hit the road, and never looked back. But something in me, a mix of pride and curiosity, drove me back to the ruins. That night the hollow was darker than before, the trees pressing in like watchful sentinels. I reached the mine entrance, my flashlight barely piercing the blackness. "Who's there?" I called out. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the void. The air shifted, carrying with it a metallic tang. A faint light flickered deep in the collapsed mine, a lantern. It bobbed slowly, as if carried by an unseen hand. I stepped closer, and the ground seemed to hum beneath my feet. The light grew brighter, and then they appeared. Shadowy figures, their forms barely distinguishable from the darkness around them. They moved silently, their lanterns casting an unnatural cold light. One turned toward me, its hollow gaze locking with mine. My legs froze, rooted to the spot, as the shadows closed in. Then she appeared, the woman in black. Her form was sharper than the others, her face pale and expressionless beneath the hood of her tattered cloak. She raised a hand, and the shadows stopped. Her eyes bored into me, unblinking and full of malice. "You disturbed their rest," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dead leaves, brittle and ancient. Before I could respond, the ground beneath me gave way. I woke hours later, sprawled in the clearing near my RV. My flashlight was gone, and my clothes were smeared with dirt. The mining helmet sat beside me, shattered into pieces. Scrawled in ash on the ground was a single word: leave. The ghosts were gone, but their warning was clear. I didn't waste time packing. As I drove out of the hollow, the shadows seemed to follow, their lanterns flickering in the rearview mirror until I reached the main road. Back in town, I stopped at a diner for coffee, my hands still shaking. The waitress gave me a sympathetic smile. "You okay, hun?" she asked. "Dead Man's Hollow," I said, my voice hoarse. Her face fell. "You shouldn't have gone there." "Yeah," I muttered. "I figured that out." Weeks later, as I prepared for another trip, I found the mining helmet on my passenger seat. It was whole again, its lamp gleaming like new. No matter how far I drive, I don't think I'll ever really leave Dead Man's Hollow. My name is Michael Shaw, and in 2018 I took my RV down to the rugged expanse of Big Bend National Park in Texas. Being a history teacher, I figured a solo trip might give me some new stories to spice up my lectures, or at least a decent tan. The open road was my escape from the usual grind of grading papers and dodging PTA meetings. I packed the essentials: canned beans, a stack of unread novels, and my old guitar. Nothing says midlife crisis like a man and his RV heading into the desert. As I drove deeper into the park, the scenery shifted from scrubby desert to towering canyons. The Rio Grande snaked its way through the landscape, a shimmering ribbon dividing two countries. I found a secluded spot near the river, far from any designated campground. Peaceful and, more importantly, no Wi-Fi, just the way I wanted it. Setting up camp, I felt a wave of contentment. No emails, no student excuses about late homework, just me and the vast wilderness. I strummed a few chords on my guitar, the sound bouncing off the canyon walls. As the sun began to set, the sky turned into a masterpiece of reds and oranges. Night fell, and I lit a small campfire, heating up some beans. The crackling fire and distant howls of coyotes were my only companions. Just as I was contemplating turning in, a faint light flickered atop a nearby ridge. Probably another camper or a park ranger, I thought, shrugging it off. After all, the desert is big enough for the both of us. The next morning, I decided to hike along the riverbank. The air was crisp, and the scenery was postcard perfect. About an hour in, I stumbled upon something odd, a campsite that looked like it had been hit by a tornado. A tent lay torn open, and belongings were scattered as if someone had left in a hurry. Amid the mess, an old, weather-beaten journal caught my eye. Curiosity piqued, I picked it up. Flipping through the pages, I realized it belonged to someone named Victor Delgado. His last entry was 2 days prior, mentioning explorations of nearby caves and strange symbols etched into the walls. The final line read, "I feel like I'm being watched." Well, that's not creepy at all, I muttered. Still, a chill ran down my spine, a feeling I couldn't quite shake. On my way back, I crossed paths with an old man carrying a heavy backpack. He had a face like worn leather and eyes that seemed to hold too many secrets. "Morning," I greeted. He gave me a long, searching look. "You out here alone?" "Just me and my RV," I replied with a grin. "Figured I'd get away from it all." He nodded slowly. "Be careful. The desert has a way of revealing things you'd rather not see." Great. Cryptic warnings from the desert sage. Next, he'd tell me to avoid the haunted cactus. "Thanks for the tip," I said aloud. "I'll keep an eye out." He stared a moment longer before continuing down the trail. Odd fellow, but I chalked it up to too much sun and not enough social interaction. Back at camp, the unease lingered. To distract myself, I decided to drive into the nearest town for supplies. The town was the quintessential dot on the map, a gas station, a diner, and a general store that looked like it hadn't changed since the 50s. At the diner, I ordered a coffee and struck up a conversation with the waitress. "Say, you wouldn't happen to know a Victor Delgado, would you?" I asked. She paused, her smile fading. "Can't say I do. Why do you ask?" "Found his journal near an abandoned campsite. Thought he might be a local." She leaned in. "People go missing out here from time to time. Vast place, easy to get lost." "Comforting," I said with a half-smile. "Remind me to leave a breadcrumb trail back to my RV." She didn't laugh. "You be careful now. Stick to the main roads." "Will do," I assured her, though my mind was already spinning tales. As I left, I couldn't help but notice the few locals in the diner were eyeing me with what seemed like suspicion. Or was it pity? Either way, it was time to head back. That evening, the desert felt different. The silence was heavier, the shadows longer. I decided to stay inside the RV and dive into one of those novels I'd been meaning to read. Around midnight, a tapping sound jolted me from the pages. It was coming from the rear of the RV. Probably just a desert squirrel auditioning for a horror movie, I thought. But then I remembered. No trees, no squirrels. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped outside. The night was still, the moon casting an eerie glow over the landscape. I walked around the RV but saw nothing. Just as I was about to chalk it up to my imagination, I heard footsteps crunching behind me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice betraying a hint of nerves. Silence. I swept the flashlight around. For a moment I thought I saw a figure in the distance, but it was too dark to be sure. My heart pounded as I backed toward the RV. A whisper floated on the wind. "Not safe here." I spun around. No one. "All right, Michael. Either you're losing it, or someone's playing a very unfunny joke," I muttered. Back inside, I locked the doors and decided sleep was the best escape. Morning couldn't come soon enough. Stepping outside, I stretched and tried to shake off the night's weirdness. Then I saw it. Scratched into the side of my RV were the words, "Not alone." "Well, isn't that just peachy?" I said aloud. Maybe it was the desert's way of saying welcome. I decided then and there to pack up and move to a different spot, or better yet, head home. As I started the engine, I glanced in the side mirror. A man stood about 50 yards away, watching me. It was the old man from the trail, but his expression had shifted from mysterious to menacing. "Time to go," I whispered, putting the RV in gear. Driving down the winding road, I tried to rationalize what was happening. Maybe the locals didn't like outsiders. Maybe this was their way of scaring me off. If so, mission accomplished. Rounding a bend, I slammed on the brakes. A pickup truck was parked across the road, blocking my path. There was no way around it. Before I could react, two men emerged, the old man and a younger guy with a scruffy beard and cold eyes. Both held rifles pointed directly at me. "Step out of the vehicle," the younger man ordered. "Is this about my extended warranty?" I quipped, hoping humor might diffuse the tension. "Now," he barked. With no other option, I stepped out, hands raised. "Look, if this is about camping fees, I'm happy to pay." "Empty your pockets," the younger man demanded. I tossed my wallet and keys to the ground. "Take whatever you want." The old man sneered. "It's not about what you have, it's about what you know." "Okay, you've lost me," I said, heart pounding. "You found Victor's journal," he stated. "Victor? The guy whose campsite looked like a tornado hit it?" "Yeah, I found his journal." Didn't know it was a crime. The younger man stepped closer. You read it? Just enough to realize the Yelp reviews for this place are severely lacking, I replied. He didn't appreciate the joke. You think this is funny? Not particularly, I admitted, but I've always been told I laugh in the face of danger. Bad habit. The old man raised his rifle. Enough, we can't let you leave. Wait, hold on, I said, thinking fast. If you let me go, I'll forget I ever saw you. Promise. Crossed my heart and hoped, well, you get the idea. They weren't buying it. Desperate, I feigned a stumble, reaching down as if to steady myself. My hand closed around a fist-sized rock. In one swift motion, I hurled it at the younger man's face. It struck him square on the nose. He screamed, dropping his rifle. Seizing the moment, I bolted toward the scrubland. Bullets kicked up dust around me as the old man fired. Adrenaline surged. I zigzagged, hoping to make a harder target. Split up, I heard the old man shout. Ducking behind a cluster of rocks, I tried to catch my breath. This is not how I envisioned this trip going, I thought. Next time, all-inclusive resort it is. I needed a plan. Peering around, I saw the younger man circling wide, blood streaming from his nose. The old man was methodically checking hiding spots. Spotting a fallen tree branch, I grabbed it and waited. As the younger man approached, I swung with everything I had. The branch connected with a satisfying thud. He crumpled to the ground. Two down, I whispered, though I knew the old man was still out there and armed. I picked up the younger man's rifle. It felt heavy and unfamiliar. Should have paid more attention during those video game tutorials, I mused. Making my way back toward the road, I kept low. The old man was nowhere in sight. Reaching the RV, I climbed in, started the engine, and floored it. As I sped down the road, the old man appeared ahead, standing in the middle of the path, rifle raised. A shot rang out, shattering the windshield. Glass sprayed everywhere, but I didn't slow down. Sorry, no time for roadblocks, I muttered, gripping the wheel tightly. At the last second, he dove out of the way. I sped past, heart pounding, knuckles white. Hours later, I reached the park entrance and found a ranger station. Bursting inside, I tried to explain between gasps. The ranger stared at me, eyes wide. Calm down, sir. Tell me exactly what happened. After relaying the events, law enforcement was called in. They found the younger man unconscious where I'd left him. The old man had vanished. A search of the area uncovered shallow graves, the remains of several missing persons, including Victor Delgado. The reality was grimmer than I could have imagined. Turns out Samuel Granger, the old man, was a former military survivalist gone rogue. He believed the desert was his domain and that outsiders were trespassers to be eliminated. His accomplice, Jacob Mills, had an arrest record of violent offences. Together, they had been preying on unsuspecting campers for years. Well, that's one way to discourage tourism, I remarked when the detective briefed me. You're lucky to be alive, he replied. Trust me, I don't feel particularly lucky. They advised me to stay in town until they could ensure my safety. Jacob was in custody, but Samuel was still at large. A few days later, I received a package at the motel, no return address. Inside was a single item, Victor Delgado's journal. Tucked between the pages was a note in scrawled handwriting. The desert keeps its secrets. Well, that's not ominous at all, I sighed. Law enforcement took it as a threat. They offered protective custody, but I declined. I think I've had enough of small towns and deserts, I told them. Time to get back to grading essays on the Industrial Revolution. I returned home, the comforts of suburban life, never more appealing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Samuel was still out there, lurking in the vastness of the desert. One evening, as I was locking up my house, I noticed a figure at the end of the street. For a moment, panic surged. But as the figure approached, I realized it was just my neighbor walking his dog. "Evening, Michael," he called. "Evening," I replied, shaking off the paranoia. Inside, I sat down and opened a book, but my mind wandered. Maybe a self-defense class wouldn't be a bad idea, or a really big dog. In the end, the authorities never found Samuel Granger. They believed he retreated deeper into the wilderness, his twisted mission unfinished. But they dismantled his operation and uncovered his crimes. They told me Samuel was a man driven mad by isolation and delusions of ownership over land that belonged to no one. His motivations were rooted in a warped ideology that saw travelers like me as intruders to be eradicated. As for me, I decided future vacations would involve beaches, piña coladas, and lots of people. The road into Zaleski State Forest twisted like a black ribbon through the trees, the late autumn chill seeping through the cracks of my old RV. It was exactly the kind of place I loved, remote, rugged, and steeped in just enough folklore to make things interesting. I'd read about Zaleski on a cryptid forum, where whispers of a forest demon had been growing louder in recent years. Disappearances, claw marks, voices mimicking loved ones. Most people dismissed it as tall tales. I wasn't most people. My name's Marcus, and for the last decade, chasing cryptids has been my passion. Not that I believed in all of them. Bigfoot, the Jersey Devil, Mothman, maybe they were real, maybe not. But there's something intoxicating about the hunt, the chance to glimpse the unknown. The general store near the park entrance was exactly what I expected. Dusty shelves, flickering neon lights, and a cashier who looked like he'd seen too much. As I grabbed a pack of jerky and a map, an older man leaned against the counter, his hunter orange vest frayed at the edges. "You camping out here alone?" he asked, his voice gravely. "Yep," I replied, folding the map. The man snorted. "You ever hear about the thing that lives out here?" I raised an eyebrow. "The Wendigo?" His expression darkened. "Call it what you want, but it ain't natural. It don't just kill, it hunts, mimics, likes to play with its food. You hear it call your name, you run." I smiled politely and paid for my things. I'd heard plenty of stories like his before, but there was something about his tone, dead serious, almost pleading, that sent a shiver down my spine. The campsite was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by towering trees, miles from the nearest road. No phone service, no neighbors, just the kind of quiet that makes you feel like the last person on earth. I set up my gear, trail cameras, a recorder, my hunting knife strapped to my belt. By the time I started a small fire, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. The first night passed uneventfully. A barred owl hooted somewhere in the distance, and the occasional crackle of the fire kept me company. I slept soundly, dreaming of nothing in particular. It was the second night when things got strange. I woke to a sound I couldn't place. At first I thought it was the wind, but no, it was heavier, more deliberate. Crunch, crunch, footsteps. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the trees. Nothing moved, but the forest felt alive, like it was holding its breath. I told myself it was just a deer, or maybe a raccoon nosing around my campsite. Then came the growl, low, guttural, and close, too close. My stomach tightened as I turned the flashlight toward the sound. The beam caught something, a flash of yellow eyes, too high off the ground to belong to any animal I'd ever seen. The light flickered, and when it steadied, the eyes were gone. Morning couldn't come fast enough. The next day I followed the tracks I found near my camp. They were deep, clawed, and much larger than any predator native to Ohio. They led deeper into the forest, winding past twisted trees and patches of scorched earth. That's when I found the clearing. The trees here were blackened and split as though struck by lightning. Bones, animal and otherwise, were scattered across the ground, some gnawed clean, others broken as if by massive jaws. A strange symbol was carved into a nearby tree, jagged and crude like a warning. I pulled out my camera, snapping photos and recording every detail. Adrenaline buzzed through me. This was it, the kind of evidence that could make my name in the cryptid community. But as the sun dipped lower, the forest seemed to change. The air grew colder, the shadows longer. A feeling of dread settled over me, like I was being watched. Back at camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The growling started again as soon as the fire died down, circling the campsite. I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. The growling stopped. For a moment the forest was silent. Then I heard it. Marcus. The voice was raspy, unnatural, but unmistakably mine. "Marcus!" It called again, drawing the word out like a taunt. I grabbed my hunting knife, backing toward the RV. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows across the clearing. My heart pounded as I scanned the darkness, my flashlight cutting through the trees. That's when I saw it. The creature stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in shadow. It was gaunt and skeletal, its grey skin stretched tight over its bones. Antlers jutted from its head, twisted and jagged, and its glowing yellow eyes burned like embers. It moved with an unnatural grace, stepping into the light as if daring me to react. Its mouth opened, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. "Marcus," it whispered, its voice echoing in my head. I ran. I didn't think, didn't plan, just sprinted for the RV and slammed the door shut behind me. My hands shook as I locked every window and grabbed the flare gun from the glove compartment. The growling returned, louder now, accompanied by the sound of claws scraping against metal. The RV rocked as the creature slammed into the side, leaving deep gouges in the aluminum. I fired a flare through the window, the bright light illuminating the clearing. The creature recoiled with an unearthly scream, its antlers catching fire as it stumbled back into the trees. For a moment, everything was still. Then the whispers began again, surrounding the RV, each voice more distorted than the last. I didn't sleep that night. When dawn finally broke, the forest seemed almost peaceful, as if nothing had happened. The scratches on the RV and the torn-up ground around the clearing were the only signs it wasn't a nightmare. I didn't stick around to find out more. By the time the sun was fully up, I was driving out of Zaleski as fast as the RV could manage. At a ranger station near the edge of the forest, I tried to explain what I'd seen. The rangers listened politely, but dismissed it as a bear encounter. "Stress can play tricks on your mind," one of them said, but I knew better. When I got home, I reviewed the footage from my camera. Most of it was corrupted, static-filled and distorted, but one frame was clear, the creature's face, its glowing eyes staring directly into the lens. I haven't gone camping since. My name is David Arnold, and back in 2016, I decided to take my RV out to the remote stretches of Badlands National Park in South Dakota. Being a city dweller from Chicago, I thought some solitude might help clear my head, a sort of detox from the daily grind. Funny how the promise of peace can lead you straight into chaos. I've always been a fan of open spaces. Maybe it's because my apartment overlooks a brick wall, or perhaps it's the allure of horizons that don't end in skyscrapers. Either way, I packed up my RV with the essentials: canned beans, a stack of paperbacks I'd been meaning to read, and enough coffee to fuel a small army. The drive was uneventful, which is more than I can say for most road trips I've taken. No flat tires, no wrong turns, just mile after mile of asphalt leading me away from the buzz of the city. As I pulled into the park, the rugged beauty of the Badlands stretched out before me, jagged rock formations painted in hues of red and orange, the kind of place that makes you feel both insignificant and profoundly alive. I found a secluded spot to park the RV, away from the handful of other campers sprinkled throughout the area. Privacy was the goal, after all. Setting up camp was a breeze. I even managed to assemble a folding chair without losing a finger, a personal victory, considering my track record with DIY projects. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I lit a small campfire. The crackling of the wood was the only sound for miles, or so I thought. Just as I was getting comfortable, a rustling noise came from behind a nearby cluster of shrubs. Probably just the wind, I told myself. Or maybe a rabbit. I wasn't exactly versed in the local wildlife, but I figured nothing out here would be too keen on bothering me. "First night in the wilderness, and I'm already jumping at shadows," I muttered, shaking my head. I took a sip of lukewarm coffee and decided to call it a night. Sleep came surprisingly easy, but it didn't last long. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a distant scream, a sharp, piercing cry that echoed through the stillness. I sat up, heart pounding. "Probably just a coyote," I whispered, though deep down I knew that wasn't the howl of an animal. Curiosity, or maybe stupidity, got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out into the cool night air. The campgrounds were enveloped in darkness, the kind that swallows the beam of a flashlight whole. I scanned the area but saw nothing unusual. "Is anyone out there?" I called out, immediately realizing how cliché it sounded. No response, just the gentle whisper of the wind against the rock formations. I shrugged it off and headed back inside. Next time, maybe pack a sense of courage, I joked to myself, attempting to lighten the mood. The next morning I decided to do a bit of hiking. The trails were well marked, and I figured a daytime adventure would be less unnerving. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often I'd hear the crunch of gravel behind me, but when I turned around, the path was empty. Get a grip, Arnold. You're not the star of some thriller novel, I chided myself. About an hour into the hike, I came across something that made my stomach churn. A campsite that looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. A tent collapsed, belongings scattered, and a half-burned-out fire still smouldering. Maybe they left in a rush. Emergency, perhaps, I mused aloud, but the eerie silence suggested otherwise. I noticed a backpack leaning against a tree. Unable to quell my curiosity, I unzipped it to find a wallet with an ID. Mark Stevenson, a guy not much older than me. There were also keys, a phone with a dead battery, and a notebook filled with sketches of the surrounding landscapes. Doesn't look like someone who planned to leave, I thought. A rustling sound snapped me out of my thoughts, this time unmistakably close. I spun around, but again, nothing. "All right, joke's over," I shouted, half expecting someone to jump out laughing, but there was only silence. Deciding it was best to head back, I started retracing my steps. The feeling of being watched intensified. Every crunch of leaves, every snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. Then I saw it, a figure in the distance, partially concealed behind a rock. I couldn't make out any features, but it was definitely a person. "Hey, you okay over there?" I called out. No response. The figure remained still. "Listen, if you're lost, I can help," I offered, taking a cautious step forward. Without warning, the figure darted behind the rock and out of sight. "Well, that's not ominous at all," I muttered. I picked up the pace, eager to get back to the safety of my RV. As I neared the campsite, a metallic smell hit me, sharp and unmistakable. Blood. My heart raced as I approached my RV. The door was ajar, which I was certain I'd closed. Inside, the place was a mess, drawers pulled out, belongings strewn about, and on the small kitchenette table lay a hunting knife, stained red. "Okay, this is officially the worst vacation ever," I whispered, panic creeping in. A noise from the back of the RV made me freeze. Footsteps. Someone was still inside. Thinking quickly, I grabbed a heavy flashlight, my only potential weapon, and prepared myself. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. Silence. Then a low chuckle echoed from the shadows of the hallway leading to the bedroom area. "Not funny, man. Show yourself," I shouted. A tall figure stepped into the dim light, a man with a gaunt face, dirty clothes, and eyes that seemed devoid of any humanity. "Looking for something?" he sneered. "Listen, take whatever you want and leave. I don't want any trouble," I said, gripping the flashlight tighter. He tilted his head, a twisted grin spreading across his face. "But I've already found what I want." Without warning, he lunged at me. I swung the flashlight, connecting with his shoulder. He stumbled back, but recovered quickly. "Feisty one, aren't you?" he taunted. I didn't wait for his next move. I bolted out of the RV, sprinting toward the main road. My mind raced. There was no one around for miles, and my cell phone was inside. Behind me, I could hear his footsteps gaining. "You can't run forever," he yelled, laughter trailing his words. Spotting a cluster of rocks ahead, I veered off the path and ducked behind them, trying to catch my breath. "Great plan, Oliver. Lead the psycho to an isolated spot," I chastised myself. I scanned the area for anything I could use as a weapon. Nothing but rocks and dirt. The footsteps slowed. He was close. "Why make this hard on yourself?" his voice echoed, desperate. I remembered the small multi-tool in my pocket, a Swiss Army knife I'd brought along for minor repairs. Hardly intimidating, but better than nothing. As he approached, I steadied my breathing. The moment he rounded the corner, I kicked up a cloud of dust into his eyes. He snarled, rubbing his face, and I seized the opportunity to plunge the small blade into his thigh. He let out a howl of pain. "That's going to leave a mark," I quipped, adrenaline fueling my sarcasm. He swung wildly, but I dodged, then took off again, heading toward the abandoned campsite I'd seen earlier. Maybe there was something there I could use. Reaching the site, I frantically searched through the scattered belongings. Then I saw it, a flare gun, half buried under a sleeping bag. "Time to light up your life," I muttered, grabbing it. He emerged from the trail, limping, but no less menacing. "You're making me angry, and you wouldn't like me when I'm angry," he growled. "Did you really just quote the Hulk?" I shot back. "Points for style, I guess." He charged at me, and I fired the flare gun. The bright projectile hit him square in the chest, igniting his shirt. He screamed, desperately trying to pat out the flames. Not wasting any time, I ran past him, heading back toward the main road. Smoke filled the air and his screams faded into the distance. After what felt like hours, I saw headlights, a park ranger's vehicle making its evening rounds. I stumbled onto the road, waving my arms. "Whoa, are you all right?" the ranger asked, stepping out. "There's a man back there. He attacked me. I think he killed someone," I gasped. "Slow down. Where is he now?" the ranger pressed. "At the abandoned campsite about 2 miles back. We need to call for backup," I insisted. He radioed for assistance and helped me into the vehicle. As we drove back, I couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and lingering dread. When we reached the site, there was no sign of the man, just the charred remains of his shirt and bloodstains on the ground. A team arrived shortly after and began a thorough search. Over the next few hours, they uncovered a shallow grave not far from the campsite. Inside were the remains of Mark Stevenson and another unidentified victim. "Looks like you stumbled upon something big," the lead investigator told me. "We've been tracking reports of missing hikers in this area for months." "Who is he?" I asked. "Name's Victor Reynolds," he replied. "Former military, gone rogue, wanted for multiple counts of murder." In that moment, it all clicked. The abandoned campsite, the eerie feeling of being watched, the calculated way he hunted me. Well, I always wanted a memorable vacation, I thought, attempting a weak smile. The investigator shook his head. "You're lucky to be alive." I nodded, exhaustion washing over me as they continued their work. I realized that sometimes the peace we seek comes with unexpected dangers, and perhaps next time I'd stick to crowded beaches. The first thing I noticed about Mirror Lake was its silence. It wasn't the absence of sound that unnerved me. It was the kind of silence that made your ears strain, expecting something to fill the void. The lake stretched before me like a polished mirror, perfectly still, reflecting the trees, sky, and my RV parked at its edge. The place was beautiful, no doubt about it. I'd come here to focus on my wildlife photography, to capture a portfolio's worth of images of the birds and deer that frequented the area. More than that, I'd come to get away from the city, from the noise, and especially from the memories of the breakup. I couldn't quite shake. "Perfect spot," I muttered to myself, unloading my camera gear and setting up my tripod. The reflection of the forest in the lake's surface was flawless, so sharp it was hard to tell where reality ended and the mirrored world began. A local hiker had passed me earlier on the trail, an older man with a face like crumpled paper. He'd paused to warn me, his voice low and serious. "Don't stare at the lake too long. They say it stares back." I laughed it off, assuming he was indulging in local folklore. But now, standing at the water's edge, I understood why someone might think that. The lake seemed alive in its stillness, watching. The next morning I was up before dawn, eager to capture the first light. The lake was blanketed in mist, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. I crouched by the water with my camera, focusing on a great blue heron perched on a log. As I adjusted the lens, something caught my eye. The reflection in the water didn't match what I saw above it. The heron was missing from the mirrored scene. I glanced up, then back down, convinced I was imagining things, but the discrepancy remained. I told myself it was the angle or the light, a trick of the water. I snapped a few shots and moved on, though unease itched at the back of my mind. That evening I set up my camera for a time-lapse shot of the sunset. I sat by the fire, reviewing the day's photos on my laptop. That's when I saw it. In one frame, a figure stood on the far side of the lake. My stomach dropped. It was unmistakably me, the posture, the outline of my jacket, even the tilt of my head. But I hadn't been on that side of the lake. Heart pounding, I grabbed my flashlight and ran to the shoreline. The figure was gone, but I found something else. Footprints. Barefoot impressions, leading to the edge of the water and then disappearing. I backed away slowly, scanning the forest for any sign of movement. Nothing stirred, but the lake surface rippled slightly as if something had just dipped beneath. The next day I couldn't concentrate. Every snap of a twig made me jump, and I kept glancing over my shoulder as I hiked the trails. The forest was too quiet, the air too still. Near a patch of wildflowers I froze. Across the lake the figure was there again, standing motionless. This time it waved. It was a slow, deliberate gesture, almost mocking. My breath caught as I realized something was wrong. The way it moved, its arms seemed to bend at unnatural angles. The motion was too smooth, too fluid. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice echoing across the water. The figure didn't respond. It simply turned and walked into the lake, vanishing beneath the surface without a splash. I spent the rest of the day at the visitor center, searching for answers. The ranger on duty raised an eyebrow when I asked about Mirror Lake. "Most folks don't camp near the lake," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "You might have heard the stories." I pressed her, and she finally relented. There was a settler back in the 1800s who claimed the lake reflected another world. He became obsessed, said he could see his better self in the water, tried to cross into the reflection. They found him drowned a few days later. She hesitated before adding, "Others have reported seeing reflections that don't match reality. They say the lake wants to pull you in, to take your place." Her words sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't leave, not yet. I had to know what was really happening. That night I sat by the lake armed with my flashlight and camera. The water was calm, the stars reflecting perfectly in its surface. I crouched by the edge, staring into the mirrored world. At first, everything seemed normal, but then I noticed my reflection wasn't mimicking me. When I tilted my head, it stayed still. When I raised my arm, it didn't follow. The water rippled and the reflection grinned, a wide, toothy smile that didn't belong to me. I scrambled back as the reflection began to move, stepping out of the water and onto the shore. It wasn't a reflection anymore. It was a copy of me, but wrong. Its eyes were hollow, its movements too smooth, like a puppet on strings. "You've been looking for answers," it said, its voice a warped version of my own. "Why not stay? I'll take care of things for you." I backed away, shaking my head. "You're not real." The doppelganger laughed, a sound that made my skin crawl. "I'm as real as you are, maybe more. I could live your life better, you know. No mistakes, no regrets." It stepped closer, its movements fluid and predatory. "All you have to do is let me." I turned and ran toward the RV, but it was faster. Its hand, cold and damp like the lake itself, grabbed my arm, pulling me back. Its strength was inhuman, and I felt myself being dragged toward the water. "You don't belong here," it hissed. "This world isn't yours." I struggled, kicking and clawing, but it only laughed, the sound echoing unnaturally in the still night. My hand brushed against my camera bag, and I remembered the lens, a smooth, reflective surface. I grabbed the camera and shoved it toward the doppelganger. Its face recoiled, hissing as its own reflection stared back at it. I didn't waste the opportunity. I broke free and grabbed every reflective object I could find. My camera, a metal water bottle, even the shards of a broken mirror I'd brought for light manipulation. I hurled them into the lake, disrupting the glassy surface. The doppelganger screamed, its voice warping into something guttural and inhuman. Its body dissolved into ripples, sinking back into the water. The lake stilled its surface once again, a perfect mirror. At dawn, I packed up and left without looking back. The road out of the park felt impossibly long, the trees pressing in on either side as I drove. I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. For a split second, I saw it, my reflection smirking back at me. Then it was gone, leaving only my pale, terrified face staring back. I don't think I'll ever camp by a lake again. My name is Joshua Powell, and back in 1996, I found myself deep in the Black Hills of South Dakota. I had taken up RV camping after my divorce, thinking a little solitude and fresh air would sort me out. I'd been an accountant for almost 20 years, working endless hours just to keep things together, and the burnout was real. So I loaded up my RV and set out for the hills, a place where I'd gone a few times as a kid and remembered as peaceful. Funny how memories can be so different from reality. The trip started off as I expected. Crisp air, trails leading nowhere, and that rare silence that seems to blanket the forest at dusk. I parked my RV on a little patch of open ground just off an old logging trail. It wasn't an official campsite, but it didn't seem like anyone would mind. I set up a little fire, opened a cold beer, and felt, for the first time in a long time, that I could actually breathe. After a couple of days, the rhythm of being alone began to settle in. I'd hike a bit, collect firewood, read by the fire at night, and listen to the sounds around me. It was exactly what I'd been craving, until I noticed things around the campsite shifting when I wasn't looking. Small things at first. A pile of kindling moved a few feet, my camping chair slightly out of place. I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness, but it gnawed at me. Something didn't feel right. On the third night, I woke up to a noise. It was subtle, like a low rustle just outside my RV. Not wanting to be the guy who panics over nothing, I brushed it off, but it came again, closer, like something was scuttling around. I reached for a flashlight, flicking it on and peering out the window. Nothing. Just an empty forest stretching into darkness. I sighed, convinced I was letting my imagination get the better of me, and went back to bed. The next morning, though, I found tracks around my campsite, big, heavy boot marks, deeper than anything I'd make. I was alone, or so I thought. I searched the area, but I saw no signs of other campers, no tents, no trail of smoke, just me and those prints, and they led straight to my RV's door before doubling back into the woods. Whoever it was had come right up to my door while I slept. That set my teeth on edge. I packed my things tighter, locking up everything in the RV, and decided to stick closer to my camp that night. The silence was louder than usual. The typical forest sounds were gone, no wind, no rustling, just dead quiet. And then, just as I was about to call it a night, I heard it. The sound of heavy boots crunching over twigs, slow and deliberate, pacing around my RV. I froze, listening. My mind raced with explanations, but nothing fit. I shut off the lights inside, hoping whoever it was wouldn't notice I was awake. For almost an hour, the footsteps continued, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, but never gone. Eventually they stopped, leaving only silence. In the morning I found something else, a crude-looking knife stuck into the ground by the fire pit. The blade was rusted and chipped. It looked old, worn, like something you'd find in a pawn-shop bargain bin. But the handle had something smeared on it, dark, sticky, and fresh. I don't know why I didn't leave right then. Stubbornness, maybe, or maybe it was a sick curiosity. Whatever it was, I stayed, keeping the knife close. That afternoon I spotted him. He was standing on a ridge, barely visible between the trees, tall, wiry, dressed in ragged clothes that might have been military ones, but they were frayed and stained. His hair was long and matted, hanging down over his face, but what caught me was his stillness. He didn't move, didn't twitch, just watched. I raised my hand in a half-wave, trying to signal some friendliness. He tilted his head just slightly, then walked back into the trees. As the day crept into evening, I decided it was time to go. Packing my things, I kept an eye on the ridge, half expecting him to return. But as the light dimmed, I heard something behind me, closer. I spun around, gripping the knife he'd left, and saw him standing by a tree, barely 10 feet away. He stared at me, a twisted smile on his face. His teeth were yellowed, some chipped and cracked, and there was a look in his eyes that chilled me more than anything else, a mix of amusement and hunger. "What do you want?" I asked, though my voice came out weak. He tilted his head again like a curious dog. "Company," he finally said, his voice a harsh whisper. "You're alone. People like you. Easy pickings." I backed up, inching toward the RV. "I'm leaving. Just stay there." He took a step forward, his smile widening. "Why leave so soon? We're just getting started." And that's when I noticed something glinting in his hand, a worn, jagged hunting knife, much like the one he'd left by my fire pit. Only this one looked fresh, sharpened. My mind went blank, instincts taking over. I lunged toward the RV door, wrenching it open and slamming it shut just as he rushed forward, his knife scraping against the metal. I scrambled to lock the door as he banged on it, his laughter echoing through the walls. It wasn't a loud laugh, but low and sickly, like he was savoring every moment. "Joshua, come on. Open up," he called in a sing-song tone. "We could have a lot of fun out here, just you and me." I stayed silent, clutching the knife he'd left as if it could somehow protect me from whatever sick game he had in mind. He kept knocking, his voice taunting me, calling my name. I could hear him circling the RV, tapping on each window as if trying to find a weak spot. Then silence. I waited, not daring to breathe, until I heard him mutter something under his breath. He slunk away, but I knew better than to assume he was gone. I kept my grip on the knife, waiting, listening. Hours passed. I sat there in the dark, afraid to move, barely letting myself breathe. Around dawn, I decided I had to make a run for it. I peered out the window, scanning the trees for any sign of him. That's when I saw it, a grisly sight just outside the RV. Freshly dug earth, and sticking out from the dirt were bones, along with pieces of old clothing. He'd made a grave right next to my campsite, like he'd been planning to add me to it. My blood went cold. That was it. I grabbed my keys and started the RV, not caring how much noise I made. As I revved the engine, I saw him in the distance, watching from the tree line, his head cocked to the side again, still smiling that twisted smile. He raised his knife, giving a mock salute as I tore out of there, tires spitting gravel. I didn't stop until I hit a gas station about 40 miles away. Shaking, I stumbled out of the RV, collapsing against the side, barely able to catch my breath. The attendant gave me a weird look, but I didn't care. I needed to get as far from the Black Hills as possible. It wasn't until later, when I was miles down the highway, that I realized I'd left the knife he'd given me behind. When I pulled into Salt Fork State Park, the late afternoon sunlight slanted through the trees, casting long shadows over the dirt road. The dense forest seemed to stretch endlessly, the occasional chirping of birds the only sound breaking the stillness. It was exactly what I needed. I parked the RV at the edge of a remote campsite, far from the main trail. I wasn't here for the typical tourist attractions. My goal was to catalogue the flora of the park, photographing, documenting, and maybe even finding a new plant species. Work had been suffocating lately, and I needed a break. The divorce? Well, that was a story for another time. As I set up camp, the ranger I'd spoken to earlier came to mind. His parting words had been odd. "Avoid the screaming woods. Locals say they're cursed." Nonsense, of course, but still, don't wander too deep. I had dismissed him with a polite nod, but the name stuck with me. Screaming Woods. It had the air of a campfire story, a ghost tale to entertain kids. Still, as I looked out at the forest stretching around me, I couldn't deny the uneasy weight of silence hanging in the air. That night, after dinner, I sat by the fire, sipping tea and flipping through my notebook. The flame crackled warmly against the cool night air. The forest around me was almost unnaturally quiet. No rustling, no chirping, just the soft hiss of the wind. And then I heard it, a scream, distant but piercing, shattering the stillness. It didn't sound human, or at least not entirely. It was guttural, high-pitched, and drawn out like an animal in pain. The sound sent a shiver down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and stood, scanning the darkness beyond the campfire. The beam cut through the trees, illuminating their rough, scarred bark. My pulse quickened as the scream echoed again, closer this time. "Hello?" I called out, stepping toward the woods. My voice felt small, swallowed by the towering trees. There was no answer. The scream stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I stayed outside for another hour, my flashlight sweeping the trees, but nothing stirred. Finally, I retreated to the RV, locking the door behind me. I told myself it was just an animal, a bobcat maybe, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. The next day, I decided to stick to my original plan, cataloguing plant species. The scream had rattled me, sure, but I wasn't about to let a weird noise ruin my trip. I took my notebook and camera and followed a narrow trail deeper into the woods. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, the trees towering and majestic, their leaves filtering the sunlight into soft green hues. But as I moved further in, something changed. The air grew heavier, the forest darker. The trees seemed different here, scarred and twisted. Their bark marred by deep gashes, dark sap oozed from some of the wounds, almost like the trees were bleeding. Then I heard it, a faint hum, so low I thought I was imagining it. But as I stood still listening, the hum grew louder, forming soft whispering words. I couldn't make out the language, but the sound set my teeth on edge. The wind, I told myself, just the wind. Still, I quickened my pace, moving away from the gnarled trees and their haunting whispers. When I reached a clearing, I sat down to collect myself, my hands trembling as I jotted notes. I couldn't ignore the creeping sense that something was wrong with this forest. That evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, I spotted something near the edge of my campsite, a small book tucked under the roots of a tree. It hadn't been there before. I picked it up carefully. The leather cover was worn, the pages yellowed and brittle. Inside, handwritten notes filled the margins in shaky script. It was a journal written by someone who had worked in the forest decades ago. The entries were frantic, almost incoherent, describing strange screams and disappearances. "The trees are alive," one entry read. "They remember the blood, the pain. They're angry." Another passage chilled me to the bone. "Stay away from the gashes. They're marks of vengeance. We should have left the forest alone." I closed the journal, my hands trembling. My logical mind fought to dismiss it as the ravings of an old logger, but deep down I felt the truth of his words. The next day, I ventured into the forest again, determined to finish my cataloguing. I told myself I was overreacting, letting the journal and the screams get into my head. But the forest didn't feel the same. The air was heavy, the trees pressing in closer. The scarred trunks seemed more numerous, their gashes deeper. As I bent down to photograph a cluster of ferns, a branch snapped loudly above me, crashing to the ground just feet away. I jumped back, heart pounding. It wasn't just a coincidence. The branch had fallen with intent. I hurried back toward the trail, but the roots seemed to shift beneath my feet, tripping me. I landed hard, scraping my palms. The whispers started again, louder this time, and I swore I heard my name among them. "Daniel." They hissed. "Daniel." I ran. That night, the screaming returned, louder and more desperate than before. I stayed inside the RV, peering through the windows, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. And then I saw it. At the edge of the firelight stood a figure, a humanoid shape made of bark and vines, its eyes glowing a faint green. It stood motionless, watching me, its hollow gaze boring into my soul. I wanted to run, to hide, but my body was frozen in place. When I blinked, the figure was gone, replaced by the silence of the woods, the truth of the screaming trees. The next morning, I sought out the park visitor centre, hoping to find answers. A woman there, older and kind-faced, listened patiently as I described what I'd seen. Her expression darkened. "You've been near the screaming woods," she said. "That land, it was sacred once. The settlers didn't listen. They tore down the trees, built over the land, and destroyed what they didn't understand." She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The forest remembers. Those scars you saw on the trees? They're marks of the settlers' crimes. The forest fights back against anyone who doesn't respect it." That night, the forest came for me. Branches scraped against the RV's windows, roots breaking through the ground and curling around the tires. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices demanding my attention. In my dreams, I stood in the heart of the forest, surrounded by the towering scarred trees. A voice boomed in my mind, "Restore or suffer. The choice is yours." When I woke, the RV was still surrounded. I knew what I had to do, Daniel's redemption. I gathered supplies and returned to the scarred trees. One by one, I worked to fill the gashes, packing them with sap and soil. I whispered apologies as I worked, promising to respect the forest to tell its story. As dawn broke, the forest seemed to calm. The whispers faded, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. I left Salt Fork State Park that day, my heart lighter, but my mind troubled. As I drove away, I noticed a small sapling near my campsite, its bark smooth, except for one detail, my name faintly etched into its trunk. I don't know if the forest forgave me, but I know it will never forget. My name's Timothy Erickson, and it was the summer of 1998 when I took my RV out to Idaho's remote Sawtooth National Forest. I had just turned 42, with nothing to show for it, but a job that took too much and a fridge full of expired groceries. The plan was simple: take a week, disappear into the woods, grill some steaks, and find a reason to get back to that desk on Monday. As it turned out, I'd get a lot more than I'd signed up for. The spot I chose was tucked between two peaks and surrounded by dense clusters of pine. The forest had that old, forgotten feeling, like time didn't quite move the way it did in the world I was used to. I figured this was what I needed, a place where my phone didn't work, and the closest thing to a deadline was how long the firewood would last. The first few days were perfect. I grilled, read a paperback I'd found stashed in the RV, and even tried my hand at a few dad jokes, just for my own amusement. The mosquitoes were bad, but I had spray, and I kept the fire going, which seemed to help. It was the third night when things got strange. Around midnight, just as I was trying to sleep, I heard footsteps outside, heavy and deliberate, breaking branches underfoot. My mind went through the usual mental checklist: bears, deer, maybe even another camper wandering through. But these steps sounded like someone was dragging something heavy. I waited, holding my breath, half convinced it was all in my head. But the footsteps circled the RV, slow and shuffling, like they were trying to get my attention. For a second I was 5 years old again, checking under the bed for monsters. And just like that kid version of me, I decided the best move was to do nothing, to keep the lights off and just listen. Minutes passed, then more minutes. The steps eventually faded, but I didn't sleep a wink. The next morning, I found a trail of footprints around my RV. They were massive, booted, way too big for anyone I'd ever met. I measured one against my own foot, a size 11, and this one was easily 2 sizes up. But what gave me pause was the splatter of dark red drops in the mud beside the tracks. It could have been an animal's blood, but something about it felt off, like I was seeing something I shouldn't. That morning I decided I'd spend one more night, and then I'd head out early. After all, I'd come out here to relax, not get involved in some backwoods murder mystery. I spent the day on edge, even skipping my planned hike. I set up camp close to the RV and kept the fire blazing as dusk settled in. I told myself there was nothing to worry about, but the silence around me was different that night, like the forest itself was holding its breath. And then it happened again. This time I was wide awake when the footsteps started. They were closer, no more than 10 feet from my door. I scrambled to turn off the lantern, throwing myself flat against the floor. The footsteps circled, slow and steady, pausing here and there like whoever or whatever was listening for something inside. Then suddenly, silence. The quiet was worse than the footsteps. I held my breath, lying there, muscles tight, every nerve in my body humming. And that's when I heard a soft scratching sound right against the RV side panel. It was deliberate, like someone testing to see if I'd respond. I felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the night air. It was like the thing outside wanted me to know it was there, wanted to see what I'd do. For a split second I thought about shouting, telling them to leave. But some instinct in me kept my mouth shut. Hours passed and the scratching eventually stopped. I must have dozed off at some point, but I woke up before dawn when the light was barely seeping through the windows. I knew I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed up fast, making as little noise as possible. But as I reached for the driver's seat, my hand froze. There was something on the ground outside the door, a bundle wrapped in cloth, soaked in what I immediately knew was blood. It was folded neatly, like a gift. My gut twisted, and I backed away from the door, deciding to wait for sunrise before moving. As soon as the sun was fully up, I grabbed a stick, crouched down, and poked at the bundle. It unfolded with a wet sound, revealing what I'd feared. A small animal, maybe a rabbit, gutted and tied together with vines in a kind of twisted knot. I gagged and stumbled back, leaving the bundle right where it lay. There was no question now. I had to get out. I drove like my life depended on it, taking the gravel roads as fast as I could, praying I wouldn't blow a tire. Just as I hit the main road, relief flooded over me, and I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. But the relief didn't last. I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. There was a man standing in the middle of the road behind me, just watching. As I sped away, he was tall, with a gaunt face and a wild beard. His clothes were dark, and there was something off about the way he stood, almost too still, like he was carved from stone. I didn't look back again. I just drove, my hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, a small place called Stanley. I parked in front of the only open diner, stumbling out of the RV and into the light like a man who had just seen a ghost. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with a no-nonsense vibe, took one look at me and poured a cup of coffee without a word. After I downed the coffee, I told her everything, half expecting her to call me crazy. But she didn't. Instead, she leaned over and said, "We've had a few people come through here with stories like yours. There's someone out there, we don't know his name, but we call him the Walker. Seems he doesn't like folks camping out in his woods." I could tell she knew more, but she kept her mouth shut. When I pressed her, she just shook her head and said, "Some folks are better off not knowing." I stayed at a motel that night, my RV parked out front, but I didn't sleep much. I kept looking out the window, half expecting to see that man standing in the shadows. The image of him in the rearview mirror wouldn't leave me. His eyes, or the lack of them really, like he wasn't all there, like he was more ghost than man. The next day, I drove back home, every mile putting more distance between me and those woods. I never did figure out who he was or what he wanted. But I did a little digging afterward, asking around online, trying to find others who'd had similar experiences. Turns out he wasn't just a local legend. The Walker, as they called him, had been spotted by campers and hikers for years. People talked about seeing his figure in the distance, watching from the tree line. Some even found bloodied animals near their campsites, just like I had. Most stories ended with people getting out before things escalated, but a few, ones buried in forums and deep corners of the internet, spoke of disappearances. Campers who hadn't made it out, whose bodies were sometimes found in pieces arranged in disturbing patterns. The police always chalked it up to animal attacks, but I knew better. I tried to push it from my mind, but now and then, when I'm driving through a dark stretch of road, I check my rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing there, just waiting. I had no business being in Blood Creek. If I had known what would happen, I would have turned the RV around and driven to the nearest crowded campground. But after the year I'd had, all I wanted was solitude. Just me, the woods, and the soft trickle of water to drown out the noise in my head. It was late afternoon when I pulled into the dirt lot at the edge of the creek. The drive through southeastern Ohio had been quiet, the scenery a blur of rolling hills and skeletal trees. Blood Creek was tucked away in the Appalachian foothills, isolated enough that cell service flickered and died miles before I arrived. Exactly what I was looking for. The creek itself was beautiful. Its crystal-clear water reflected the golden light of the setting sun, and a canopy of branches swayed gently overhead. There wasn't another soul in sight. I parked the RV and stepped out, breathing in the cool autumn air. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of peace. My first stop had been Maggie's bait shop, a small sagging shack about 10 miles from the creek. I'd planned to fish while I was there, so I stopped to grab some supplies. Maggie, the shop's owner, was a wiry older woman with sharp eyes and a smoker's rasp. "Blood Creek, huh?" she said when I mentioned my destination. Her tone was light, but something shifted in her expression. "Yeah," I replied. "It's supposed to be pretty quiet out there." Her gaze darkened. "Quiet, sure, but people don't camp there, not anymore." I laughed nervously. "Why is that?" Maggie leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "That place ain't right. Not since her." She just shook her head and muttered something about bad luck before ringing me up. I didn't push for details. I'd heard enough local legends in my time to know they were mostly tall tales, but as I left the shop, her words clung to me, nagging at the back of my mind. The first night passed uneventfully. I made myself a simple dinner, sat by the water until the stars came out, and crawled into bed, led by the soft gurgle of the creek. I didn't dream that night, or if I did, I didn't remember it. The second night was different. I woke in the middle of the night, heart pounding for no reason I could explain. At first I thought a noise had startled me awake, but the RV was silent. Outside, the forest was still, too still. I glanced out the window. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the clearing. Something moved at the edge of the creek, just beyond the reach of moonlight. A figure, tall and thin, with long dark hair trailing down its back. I blinked, and it was gone. The next morning I brushed off the strange vision as leftover stress. I spent the day exploring the woods, following the creek as it wound through the trees. It was easy to see why people loved this place. The air was crisp, the colours vibrant, and the isolation felt like a balm on my frayed nerves. That evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, I noticed something strange outside the RV. Etched into the dirt near the door was a symbol I didn't recognise. It was crude but deliberate, a circle with jagged lines radiating from its centre. I knelt to get a closer look, but the wind picked up, scattering leaves across the ground. When I looked back, the symbol was gone. That night, the dreams began. In the dream, I was standing at the edge of the creek. The water was black and still. A woman stood across from me, her figure half hidden by shadows. Her eyes were hollow pits, and her mouth moved soundlessly as she held out a twisted bundle of twigs, bound with strands of dark hair. I woke gasping, my chest tight. The RV was dark and silent, but my heart hammered like I'd just sprinted a mile. The next day, I returned to Maggie's shop. She looked surprised to see me. "Thought you'd be long gone by now," she said, eyeing me warily. "Something weird happened last night," I said, hesitating before describing the dream and the strange symbol. Maggie's expression hardened. She lit a cigarette, her hands shaking slightly. "I told you that place ain't right," she muttered. "She's always looking. Looking for what? Someone to take her place." Maggie said they say she was a witch, drowned in that creek centuries ago. Now she haunts it, cursing anyone who stays too long. "That's ridiculous," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Maggie shrugged, blowing a stream of smoke toward the ceiling. "Stay another night, and you'll see." Despite her warning, I couldn't bring myself to leave. I told myself it was stubbornness, but deep down I needed to know if it was all in my head. That night I stoked the fire higher than usual, its warm glow keeping the encroaching darkness at bay. The dreams came again, more vivid this time. I was being dragged toward the creek by an unseen force, my feet scraping against the muddy ground. The woman's face loomed above me, her empty eyes piercing through my soul. I woke to find myself standing barefoot at the edge of the creek. My heart stopped when I looked down at my hands. The twisted bundle from my dream was there, real and solid, twigs and hair bound tightly with a strip of leather. The forest seemed to hold its breath as I stumbled back toward the RV, clutching the bundle like it might ripen. My legs shook, and the whispers started again, faint but growing louder with every step. "Come to me," they said, the words slithering through the trees. Back in the RV, I slammed the door shut and locked it. The whispers pressed against the walls, growing louder until they were deafening. I clutched the bundle, unsure of what to do. The fire outside flickered and died, leaving me in total darkness. Panic clawed at my chest as the air grew thick and cold. The woman appeared outside the window, her face pale and distorted, her hollow eyes boring into mine. "Come to me," she whispered, her voice filling the RV. I screamed and hurled the bundle into the fire pit outside. The flames roared to life, consuming the bundle in an instant. The woman shrieked, a sound that rattled through my bones, before vanishing into the night. The whispers stopped. The RV was silent. At dawn, I left Blood Creek without looking back. The forest was quiet as I drove away, but the unease lingered. I tried to convince myself it was over, that the nightmare had ended. Days later, I found the bundle under my pillow. It was intact, untouched by the flames. I stared at it for a long time. My reflection in the window caught my attention. My eyes, once bright and full of life, were hollow and dark, just like hers. The witch wasn't gone. She was waiting. I didn't come to the forest to be haunted. I came to forget. The sun was setting when I parked the RV in a small clearing, far enough from the main campground that I wouldn't hear the chatter of families or see the glow of campfires. I needed quiet, a space to untangle my thoughts. The past month at work had been a train wreck. Another code blue, another patient I couldn't save. Their faces blurred together now, a collage of failure etched into my memory. The forest seemed like balm, towering trees, the soft murmur of the Clear Fork River somewhere in the distance. I took a deep breath, letting the clean air fill my lungs. Maybe here I could finally breathe again. After setting up camp, I decided to explore before it got too dark. A trailhead nearby led to Moonville Tunnel, an old railway passage I'd read about online, supposedly haunted, but I didn't buy into that nonsense. Still, it would make for a good story to tell later. The trail was quiet, except for the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. When I reached the tunnel, the sight was surreal. A gaping black mouth surrounded by moss-covered stone. Its archway was covered in graffiti. The air was cooler here, a sudden drop in temperature that raised goosebumps on my skin. I stepped inside, pulling out my phone to snap a picture. That's when I heard it, a faint melodic hum like someone singing a hymn. I froze, the hairs on my neck standing up. Hello? I called, my voice echoing. The singing stopped. I shone my flashlight down the tunnel, the beam cutting through the gloom. At the far end, something flickered. A light, faint and yellow, like an old lantern swaying in the breeze. Is someone there? I asked. No answer. The light vanished as quickly as it appeared. I swallowed hard and backed out of the tunnel, the weight of unseen eyes pressing on my back. Night fell quickly in the forest. I cooked a quick dinner on the camp stove, trying to shake off the unease from the tunnel. It was probably just a trick of the light, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. But I was lying. Half asleep in bed that night, the knocking started. 3 soft taps, like a child at the door. My heart leapt into my throat. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand, fumbling with the switch. Who's there? I called, but there was no answer. I hesitated, then crept to the door and cracked it open. A boy stood there, pale and thin, dressed in clothes that looked decades old. His eyes were sunken, and his lips trembled as he spoke. "Please don't forget us," he said. The words sent a chill down my spine. Before I could respond, the boy turned and ran into the woods, his small frame swallowed by the darkness. The next morning, I couldn't shake the image of the boy. I walked the perimeter of my campsite, searching for any sign of him. That's when I noticed the carvings on the trees, names, dozens of them etched into the bark in jagged letters. Some were accompanied by dates, others by strange symbols I didn't recognize. One name stood out, Eleanor. My name. The carving was fresh, the edges of the letters still raw and oozing sap. I stumbled back, my heart racing. I needed answers. I drove into the nearest town and found the public library. It didn't take long to find records of disappearances tied to the forest. Many of the names matched those I'd seen on the trees, people who'd vanished without a trace. Their cases were long forgotten. An older woman with a kind face, the librarian, noticed my growing pile of newspaper clippings. "You've been to Moonville Tunnel, haven't you?" she asked. I nodded. She hesitated, glancing around before leaning in close. "The forgotten ones," she whispered. "Spirits of those who disappeared in the forest. They can't move on because no one remembers them." Her words lingered as I drove back to camp that night. The footsteps began shortly after I sat by the campfire. Soft and deliberate, circling the RV. I shone my flashlight into the trees, but the beam caught only shadows. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. The footsteps stopped, but the sense of being watched didn't fade. I locked the RV door and huddled inside, my heart pounding. Sleep was impossible. My dreams were vivid and horrifying, wandering the forest, lost while voices whispered my name. When I woke, the name Eleanor was carved into the side of the RV. The boy appeared again the next evening, standing just beyond the firelight. "Why are you following me?" I demanded, gripping my flashlight tightly. "We want to be remembered," he said, his voice trembling. "Please help us." Before I could respond, shadows merged from the trees, dozens of figures, their faces gaunt and pale, their eyes hollow. They surrounded the campsite, their forms flickering like static images. I stumbled back, panic clawing at my chest. "What do you want?" I whispered. "Say our names," they whispered in unison. "Tell our stories." I returned to the tunnel, hoping to find a way to help them. The air inside was suffocating, heavy with an unnatural chill. The shadows followed me, their whispers growing louder. At the far end of the tunnel, a shape emerged, tall, inhuman, a mass of darkness that seemed to pulse and writhe. The entity spoke without words, its voice invading my mind. Leave or stay forever? I refused to run. I gathered the personal items scattered throughout the tunnel, rusted jewelry, scraps of fabric, and carried them back to the campsite. Under the starlit sky, I built a circle of candles and laid the items within. One by one, I read the names aloud from the clippings I'd found. My voice shook but remained steady. The shadows gathered around me, their forms more solid now. The boy stepped forward, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," he whispered as his body began to fade. The entity screamed, a sound that ripped through the air like thunder. It surged toward me, but the light of the candles flared bright, forcing it back. The shadows disappeared and the forest fell silent. The carvings were gone. The next morning, the bark of the trees was smooth and unmarked. I drove away, the weight of the forest lifting with each mile. But at night, when the world is quiet, I still hear the boy's voice. "Please don't forget us." The mist rolled in quicker than I'd expected, but I didn't mind. I loved the fog, loved the way it muted everything, softened the edges of the world, made it all feel a little more mysterious. It was perfect for my project. Whispers of the Wild was going to be my best work yet. I could feel it after everything I'd been through in the past year, hell, in the past month. This was the reset I needed. Just me, my camera, and the Smoky Mountains. No one to answer to, no one to lean on, just the way I liked it. I hefted my backpack higher on my shoulders and adjusted my camera strap. The trail was rough, more overgrown than I'd expected, but that was part of the draw. The more remote the location, the better the shot. No tourists ruining the landscape with their neon jackets or loud conversations. Just untouched wilderness. But untouched wilderness had its downsides. My camera had been acting up since I'd arrived. I'd missed some great shots because of it. Fog rolling over the peaks, a hawk perched on a branch just feet away. But I told myself I didn't care. This trip wasn't about getting everything right. It was about getting away. I paused to catch my breath and set the camera down on a fallen log. The lens fogged up almost instantly in the damp air, and when I wiped it off with the corner of my jacket, I realized I'd smeared dirt across it. Typical. "Come on," I muttered, digging into my bag for a lens cloth. As I crouched there, rubbing at the stubborn streak of mud, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. At first I thought it was a woodpecker. There were plenty of them around these parts, but it didn't sound right. Too slow, too steady. Tap, pause, tap, pause. I looked up, but the fog was thickening, swallowing the trees just a few yards ahead of me. The tapping stopped. I told myself it was just a branch knocking against a tree in the wind. I wasn't scared of being out here alone. In fact, I preferred it. No one to distract me, no one to get in my head. Still, the silence that followed felt too quiet, like something was waiting. I shoved the lens cloth back into my pack and stood up, forcing myself to move on. I had a campsite to reach before dark, and I wasn't about to get spooked by a weird noise, at least not this early in the trip. The fog never really lifted by the time I reached the clearing where I planned to camp. It was so thick I could barely see 10 feet in any direction. I set up my tent quickly, more out of habit than anything else, though I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. I wasn't sure why. There was no one around, no animals scurrying through the underbrush, not even a bird call to break the stillness. I figured a good night's sleep would shake off the nerves. I was just tired. The last few months had been brutal. Breaking up with Paul, the constant fights before it, the way he made me feel like I couldn't do anything right. This trip was supposed to be my way of proving him wrong, proving to myself that I didn't need him, that I didn't need anyone. But the anxiety crept up on me anyway, a tight knot in my chest as I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the ceiling of my tent. Then there was that tapping again, faint and far off. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, just the wind, just the forest. But then it stopped abruptly, like someone had flipped a switch, and I heard something else, something worse. A whisper. It was so faint I could barely make it out, but it was there, threading through the fog outside. It didn't sound like words, not exactly, but it was too rhythmic to be wind, too deliberate. I sat up, listening hard, my heart racing. Nothing. I grabbed my flashlight, clicked it on and aimed it through the thin walls of the tent. Just mist and shadows. The whispering stopped, but the silence that followed felt alive, thick with something I couldn't name. I switched off the light, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. The next morning I packed up quickly. I wasn't scared, I told myself. I just wanted to get moving. The fog had lifted slightly, but the forest felt wrong somehow, like it was holding its breath. I didn't like it. I wanted to get to higher ground, get some better shots, and move on. By midday I'd made it to a rocky ridge that overlooked a valley. It was beautiful, exactly the kind of shot I'd come for. The fog clung to the trees below, creating a sea of white with the mountain peaks poking through like islands. I snapped a few photos, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. When I reviewed the pictures on my camera, my breath caught in my throat. There were figures in the fog. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, just shadows cast by the trees, but the more I zoomed in, the clearer they became. Tall, thin shapes, barely visible but definitely there, human or something like it, standing motionless among the trees, watching me. I whipped my head around, scanning the valley below. There was no one, just mist and trees. But in the photos the figures were there. I lowered the camera, heart pounding. I hadn't imagined it, I couldn't have. And yet the air around me felt suddenly cold. Not the kind of cold that comes with a change in the weather. This was different, deeper, like it had seeped into my bones. I should have left right then, packed up and headed back to the main trail. But I didn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was keeping me here, pulling me deeper into the wilderness. That night I camped by a small stream. I hadn't seen any more figures, but the unease clung to me like a second skin. I felt like I was being watched constantly. Every time I looked over my shoulder there was nothing there, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I built a fire, more for comfort than warmth, and tried to distract myself by reviewing the day's photos. That's when I noticed something else. The figures in the fog weren't in just one picture. They were in all of them. Some barely visible, others clearer, standing in groups or alone. Always watching. Always there. My hands started shaking and I nearly dropped the camera. It was impossible. I'd been out there for hours and I hadn't seen anyone. Not a single hiker, no animals, no birds, but there they were, in every shot. Suddenly the whispering started again. It was louder this time, closer. I stood up, flashlight in hand, scanning the trees. The beam of light cut through the mist, but I couldn't see anything. Still, the whispering grew louder, like it was circling me, coming from all directions at once. You shouldn't be here. That's what it sounded like, a woman's voice, soft but firm, blending with the rustling leaves and flowing water. It wasn't clear, not exactly, but the meaning was clear. I wasn't welcome. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest, and back toward the tent. The whispering followed me, growing sharper, angrier. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief second I saw her. She stood at the edge of the trees, tall and thin, dressed in old, ragged clothes. Her face was pale, hollow-eyed, and filled with sorrow. She didn't move. She just stood there, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Then, just as quickly as she appeared, she was gone. The flashlight flickered back to life, and the whispering stopped. I didn't sleep that night. By the time dawn broke, I knew I had to leave. This wasn't some trick of the mind. No matter how much I tried to rationalize it, there was something in these woods, something angry, and I had trespassed. I packed up my gear in record time and set off toward the trailhead. But the forest seemed different now, like the trees were closing in on me. The path I'd taken to get here was gone, swallowed by the fog. My compass spun wildly, useless, and the map was no help in the unmarked wilderness. Panic gnawed at my insides as I stumbled through the underbrush, trying to keep my bearings. But the more I walked, the more lost I became. And all the while I could feel her watching, waiting. The whispering started again as I crossed a small clearing, louder this time, angrier. I dropped my pack, desperate, and spun around. There she was, standing in the mist, her eyes locked on mine. I fell to my knees, breath coming in ragged gasps. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though my voice was barely audible over the growing wind. I didn't mean to. Her expression softened just slightly, and for the first time I felt something other than fear. She wasn't just angry, she was in pain. "I'm sorry," I repeated, louder this time. "I shouldn't be here. I didn't know." The wind died down, the whispering faded, and slowly the figure in the mist began to dissolve, melting back into the fog. I sat there for what felt like hours, heart racing, too afraid to move. But she was gone. The air felt lighter, the forest less oppressive. When I finally stood, I saw it. Small, barely visible in the fog, a stone hidden among the trees, a grave long forgotten, buried deep in the wilderness. I didn't touch it. I didn't even get close. I just stood there for a moment, paying my respects to the spirit I'd disturbed. Then, without looking back, I turned and walked away. I made it out of the Smokies that day, but the images, the figures in the fog, the woman's sorrowful eyes followed me. I never published the photos from that trip. Some things, I realized, weren't meant to be captured. Some things were meant to be left alone. I've always found comfort in the silence of the woods, out here away from people, away from the world. You can think straight. George Washington and Jefferson National Forest had been my sanctuary for years, my escape from the clutter of civilization, but this time something felt different. It was as if the land itself was holding a secret it didn't want to share. It had been a rough few months. Lisa left me, and I couldn't say I didn't see it coming. I'd been distant, losing myself in work, then losing the work altogether. I thought a few days alone, hunting and camping, would clear my head. I needed space, and the mountains were the only place I knew where I could truly breathe. The plan was simple. 3 days, 4 tops. Head out to the edge of Silent Pines, an area where the deer roam freely and the mountains are still untouched by the tourist crowd. I'd bag a buck, maybe 2, and return with meat for the freezer. Just me, my gear, and the quiet hum of nature. But it didn't take long for that comfort and hum to go disturbingly quiet. The first day was uneventful, at least at first. I parked my truck at the trailhead, loaded up my pack, slung my rifle over my shoulder, and began the familiar hike into the heart of the forest. My boots crunched over the leaf-covered trail as I climbed higher, the dense trees closing in around me. The fresh mountain air was cool, the perfect kind of crisp that made you feel alive, but something was off. I noticed it halfway through the hike. The usual sounds of the forest, the birds, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, were missing. There was only the sound of my own footsteps and the occasional creak of the trees swaying gently in the wind. I shook it off as nerves. It was always a little eerie out here in the deep woods, especially when you were alone. That was part of the appeal. I told myself it was just the tension I'd been feeling lately, everything weighing on my chest, turning normal things into problems. I set up camp in the clearing near the stream I remembered from previous trips. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountain ridge, casting long shadows over the landscape. The fire crackled warmly as I cooked up some canned stew, sipping from a tin cup of lukewarm coffee, trying to push away the gnawing feeling that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't until later that night, after the fire had burned low and I was stretched out in my sleeping bag, that I noticed the first real sign. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was just an animal. I mean, what else could it be? Deer? Maybe a raccoon? But it didn't sound like that. It sounded like someone walking, a soft, deliberate crunch in the leaves, moving slowly as if it was circling the camp. I lay still, holding my breath, listening intently. The steps grew closer, then stopped. I sat up slowly, reaching for the flashlight and rifle by my side. The firelight flickered dimly, casting long, jittery shadows around the clearing, but there was nothing there. I scanned the tree line, heart pounding harder than I'd like to admit. Nothing moved, just trees standing tall and silent, watching. Must have been the wind, I muttered, my voice shaky. I lay back down, my grip tight on the rifle. I'd always prided myself on being a tough, no-nonsense kind of guy, but something about those footsteps didn't sit right with me. It wasn't the sound itself, it was the feeling that came with it, like I was being watched. The next morning things got worse. My water jug was gone. I thought I'd been careful about where I left it, but maybe I hadn't sealed it tight. Maybe an animal dragged it off during the night. I searched the area looking for signs of raccoons or coyotes, but all I found were footprints, human, barefoot and small like a child's. But what child would be wandering around the woods, miles away from the nearest road, in the dead of night? I crouched down, running my fingers over the soft dirt where the prints had pressed into the earth. They seemed fresh, leading in a slow, meandering pattern around the campsite before disappearing into the woods. My skin crawled, a chill running down my spine as I stared at the tracks, my mind racing through every possible explanation. None of them made sense. By midday, I had convinced myself it must have been some local kids playing a prank. Maybe I'd stumbled into someone's turf without realizing it. But as I hiked deeper into the woods, rifle ready, the sense of unease only grew stronger. Every step I took felt heavy, like the trees themselves were watching me, closing in tighter. Then I saw it. I was tracking a deer along the ridgeline when I noticed movement in the trees just ahead. At first I thought it was the buck I'd been hunting, but then it stepped out into the clearing, a figure, tall, hunched and gaunt. Its body was draped in shadow, but I could see the faint outline of its pale, too long limbs, twisted in ways a man shouldn't be. And those eyes, two glowing yellow eyes, staring right at me. I froze, rifle raised, heart hammering in my chest. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the wind dead and still around us. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. It just stood there, watching me. "Who the hell are you?" I called out, my voice cracking in the silence. No answer. I swallowed hard, taking a step back. The figure disappeared into the trees as silently as it had appeared. My hands were shaking, the rifle's barrel wobbling as I lowered it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I tried to tell myself it was just a shadow, a trick of the light. But I knew better. I'd seen it, and whatever it wasn't human. That night, the footsteps returned, louder this time, circling the camp with purpose. I stayed awake, rifle in hand, listening to the crunch of leaves as it moved closer. Every time I thought I'd hear it right outside my tent, the steps would stop, leaving only the suffocating silence. I couldn't sleep, couldn't even close my eyes without imagining those yellow eyes watching me from the darkness. By the third day, I was a mess, exhausted, jumpy, paranoid. I hadn't seen the figure again, but I could feel it following me, watching. The forest, once my refuge, had become a prison. I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how fast I walked, no matter how deep I went, it was always just behind me, waiting. That afternoon I found more footprints. This time they were right outside my tent, circling it in strange, looping patterns. There were dozens of them, overlapping, almost chaotic, as if someone or something had danced around the camp all night. My heart raced as I traced the tracks, panic creeping into my bones. The final straw came that evening. I was sitting by the fire, trying to calm my nerves when I heard it again. The soft whispering voice carried on the wind. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the rustle of the trees, but I could make out one thing clearly. It was my name. Nate. I shot to my feet, spinning around, scanning the darkened woods for any sign of movement. The voice called again, softer this time, but closer. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my gear, stuffed it into my pack as fast as I could, heart pounding in my ears. I needed to leave now. Whatever was out there, whatever had been stalking me for days, wasn't just a trick of the mind. It was real, and it wasn't going to let me go easily. As I slung my pack over my shoulder and reached for my rifle, I felt it, a presence behind me. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. There, standing at the edge of the firelight, was the figure. Tall, twisted, with limbs too long and eyes glowing a sickly yellow. Its face was pale and gaunt, hollow eyes staring into me, as if it could see straight through my skin and into my soul. I raised the rifle, but before I could pull the trigger, it vanished, just gone, like smoke dissolving into the night air. I ran. I didn't care about the trail, didn't care about my gear. I ran as fast as I could through the forest, branches slapping at my face, rocks and roots tripping me up as I sprinted blindly through the trees. I could hear it behind me, the soft crunch of footsteps following, never far behind. By the time I reached the trailhead, my lungs were burning, my legs felt like jelly, and my mind was racing with fear. I threw myself into the truck, slamming the door shut. The silence inside the cab was deafening. My hands shook as I fumbled for the keys, finally starting the engine and peeling out of there as fast as I could. Even now, weeks later, I can't get it out of my head. The figure, those eyes, the voice that called my name, luring me deeper into the woods. I haven't told anyone about it. No one would believe me anyway, just another man who got lost in the forest, right? But I know what I saw. I know what was out there. I haven't been back to the mountain since, and every time I close my eyes, I still see it, watching, waiting. The forest around me was too quiet. I'd been sitting by the campfire outside my RV, enjoying the silence for hours, but now something felt off, the kind of off you feel in your gut before your brain catches up to what's happening. No wind, no rustling in the leaves, just dead stillness. That was the first thing I noticed when I pulled up to this remote campsite, deep in Mount Hood National Forest. A place like this should have been full of life, birds, insects, something. But the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant hum of the radio I'd brought along. I needed quiet after everything that had happened over the past year. I wasn't looking for distractions, just isolation. After my wife's death, nothing made sense anymore. People kept telling me I needed to move on, but the noise of life, the sympathy, the well-meaning advice, the friends who didn't know what to say, became unbearable. So I packed up and hit the road, hoping the wilderness would give me space to think, or maybe stop thinking altogether. I thought the forest would help. It had until now. The radio's static broke the silence, a sudden burst of garbled noise that made me jump. I turned my head toward the RV, where the old ham radio sat inside. I hadn't even touched the thing in hours. It was an antique one I'd brought along to mess around with during my downtime, but the signal had been dead all day. No stations, no chatter, nothing until now. I stood up from the fire, walking over to the RV and ducking inside to check the radio. The static was louder, more insistent, like it was trying to form words but couldn't quite get there. I twisted the dials, searching for a clearer signal, but all I got was more white noise. Then, through the crackling, I heard it. A voice, faint and garbled, speaking numbers. 1, 3, 7, 8, 9. The numbers repeated over and over, mechanical and cold, like a voice from an old number station. It didn't make sense. I was miles from anywhere, and this was supposed to be a dead zone. No signal, no interference. The voice paused for a moment. Then the numbers started again. 1, 3, 7. It sent a chill through me, but I told myself it was just some rogue signal bouncing off the atmosphere, maybe a military transmission. There were logical explanations for this kind of thing, I was sure. But the way the numbers repeated over and over felt wrong, like the message wasn't for just anyone, like it was for me. I shut the radio off, my fingers trembling slightly. I wasn't here for this. I needed quiet. Not some weird radio signal rattling around in my head. The next day, I tried to forget about the radio. I spent the morning hiking through the woods, the towering pines looming overhead like silent giants. The air was cool and damp, the sky just a sliver of grey through the dense canopy. But something gnawed at me, a faint buzzing at the back of my mind. No birds, no animals, just silence. When I returned to the campsite, the radio was on again, static blaring from the speakers. I hadn't touched it. I stepped inside the RV, staring at the radio like it might come to life. The static was louder now, more intense. I could feel it in my bones, like the vibration from a low hum in the ground. And beneath the static, the numbers were back. 1, 3, 7, 8. I slammed my hand down on the off switch, killing the sound. My pulse was racing, my mind scrambling for an explanation. It had to be a glitch. Something with the wiring, maybe a stray electrical signal. I'd worked with enough technology over the years to know that things sometimes did strange things when you weren't looking. But the numbers, the way they were so clear, so deliberate, made me uneasy. I stepped back outside, trying to push the growing sense of unease away. That's when I noticed the man standing at the edge of my campsite. I hadn't heard him approach. He was just there, tall, scruffy, wearing a weather jacket and a backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked like a camper, but there was something about the way he stood, stiff and tense, like he was waiting for something to happen. "Hey," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "You lost?" The man looked at me, his face tight with anxiety. I heard it too. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. "Heard what?" "The signal, the numbers," he said, glancing toward the RV. "I've been picking it up on my own radio. It's not normal." My mouth went dry. "You've heard it too?" The man nodded. "I'm Benny," stepping closer. His voice was low. "I was camping a few miles down the road. I've been getting static, voices, weird electrical interference. My GPS stopped working. My cell phone drained to 0 in minutes." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "What do you think it is?" Ben shook his head, his eyes darting toward the trees. "I don't know, but it's not natural. The way the signal moves, it's like it's getting closer." I didn't know how to respond to that. I was a man of logic, of science. Signals were signals. Glitches were glitches. But there was something about the way Ben spoke, the fear in his eyes, that made my skin crawl. That night, the radio came to life again. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the campfire and the peaceful silence of the woods, but the static was louder than before. The numbers were clearer, more insistent. 1, 3, 7. Ben was sitting across from me, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. His eyes were constantly scanning the dark forest around us. He hadn't relaxed since he showed up, and I couldn't blame him. There was something wrong here, something I couldn't explain. "You think it's some kind of broadcast?" I asked, more to fill the silence than anything. Ben shook his head. "I don't think it's a broadcast at all." "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I think it's a warning, or a signal from something out there." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. A warning from what? Before I could ask more, the static on the radio cut out for a moment. There was only silence, the kind of silence that presses down on you, that makes your skin prickle with anticipation. Then a sound, a soft, rhythmic clicking, like something metallic tapping against wood. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees, but the beam only revealed darkness. The clicking grew louder, echoing through the forest. Then, through the radio, a voice crackled to life. "We see you." My blood ran cold. Ben's eyes widened, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. I could barely whisper back, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "We see you." The voice repeated, distorted and mechanical. "We see you." I stood up, flashlight shaking in my hand. The clicking sound was closer now, moving through the trees. The forest seemed to pulse with energy, the air growing thick and heavy, like the atmosphere itself was alive. "I think we should leave," Ben said, his voice tight with fear. For once, I agreed. The next morning, I found Ben's tent abandoned. His gear was scattered around the clearing, but there was no sign of him, no footprints, no note, just the cold, empty forest and the low hum of static that had settled into the air like a living thing. I tried to follow his tracks, but they vanished in the thick underbrush. It was like he'd walked into the trees and disappeared. The GPS on my phone was useless, spinning me in circles, the battery draining faster than I'd ever seen. The static in my ears grew louder the further I went, like the signal was inside my head, vibrating through my skull. The numbers were back too, repeating over and over, etched into my mind, 137. By midday, I stumbled across something I hadn't expected, an old, dilapidated radio tower hidden deep in the woods. The metal was rusted, vines crawling up the sides, but it was still faintly humming with power. I climbed the tower, every step echoing in the stillness. My heart hammered in my chest. At the top, I found the source of the signal, a small glowing device pulsing with an eerie cold light. It didn't belong here. It wasn't part of the original tower. It was something else, something foreign. I reached out and touched it, and the static in my head exploded. The numbers, the clicking, the voices, all crashed into me at once in an unbearable cacophony of sound. I stumbled back, nearly falling off the tower as the forest seemed to come alive around me. The lights returned, flickering in the trees, cold and mechanical. The clicking grew louder, more frantic, as if something was chasing me. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back to the RV. The lights followed me, the clicking never far behind. But I managed to get inside and slam the door shut. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, the device still clutched in my hand. As I drove away, the static began to fade, but the numbers never left me. They echoed in my mind, a constant whisper. Even as the forest disappeared in the rearview mirror, it didn't stop. It's been days now, and I'm still hearing them. 137. I can't get them out of my head, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there, whatever sent that signal, knows where I am, and it's not done with me yet. I thought I knew isolation. I'd spent years driving across the country chasing celestial events, camping in places no one else dared to go. Black Rock Desert was supposed to be no different. I'd chosen this spot because it was one of the darkest places in the United States, far from the light pollution of cities, with nothing but the stars above and the cracked earth below. A perfect place to watch the meteor shower I'd been anticipating for months. But the desert has a way of getting under your skin. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun blazing high, its rays bouncing off the endless white of the salt flats. The ground stretched out in every direction, flat and featureless, interrupted only by distant mountains rising like ghosts on the horizon. It was beautiful in a desolate way, the kind of place that makes you feel small and insignificant. Exactly what I needed. The RV's engine rumbled to a stop, kicking up dust as I parked. I opened the door, stepping into the dry, hot air. The silence was immediate. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of civilization, just a profound, almost oppressive stillness. I told myself it was peaceful, that this was what I wanted. A few days alone in the desert to focus on my photography and watch the night sky. But as I looked out over the vast expanse of cracked earth, a strange feeling settled in my chest, like a weight pressing down. I brushed it off. It had been a long drive, and the heat was getting to me. I'd feel better once the sun went down. I spent the first few hours setting up camp, adjusting my telescope, and testing my camera equipment. The sky was still a blazing blue, but the desert's unforgiving heat was beginning to fade, replaced by a sharp chill as the sun sank lower. By the time dusk arrived, the temperature had plummeted, and I retreated into the RV to grab a jacket before stepping back outside. That's when the radio first crackled to life. I'd brought my old ham radio along, hoping to catch some weather updates or maybe listen in on local astronomy broadcasts. I hadn't expected much out here, but the static-filled hum surprised me. I turned the dial, searching for a signal, and for a moment I thought I'd found one, a faint voice cutting through the static. "Don't stay." I froze. The words were barely audible, like a whisper carried on the wind, but they were unmistakable. I leaned closer, adjusting the frequency, but the voice was gone, replaced by the familiar hiss of static. I turned the radio off, chalking it up to interference, old equipment, or weird atmosphere. Still, the unease in my chest was growing. The first night was incredible. The sky came alive with meteors streaking across the blackness, more stars than I'd ever seen in my life. I stood in awe, snapping pictures, adjusting my telescope, completely losing track of time. Out here, under the stars, the rest of the world felt far away. It was just me, the night, and the vastness of space. And yet, something nagged at me. When I reviewed the photos later, I noticed something strange in the background of one of my long exposure shots. There was a blur, a faint, almost imperceptible smudge. At first I thought it was a mistake. Dust on the lens, maybe, or a glitch in the camera's settings. But as I scrolled through the rest of the images, the blur appeared again and again in each photo. It seemed to be getting closer to the RV. I wiped the camera lens, took another shot and stared hard at the screen. Nothing. It had to be some kind of artifact from the desert air, the heat mixing with the cold night, playing tricks on the lens. Still, the feeling in my chest tightened. I turned in early, trying to push the unease aside, telling myself I'd check the equipment in the morning. Day 2 was different. I woke to a stifling heat that even the RV's air conditioning couldn't seem to fight. I cursed, fiddling with the controls, but the air blowing through the vents was weak and warm. I grabbed a bottle of water and stepped outside, hoping the breeze would provide some relief, but the air was dead still as the grave. I spent most of the day trying to fix the RV's engine, which had been acting sluggish since I arrived. I knew I should be enjoying the desert, but the more time I spent out there, the more the silence started to gnaw at me. It wasn't the peaceful isolation I had expected. It felt watchful. As the day dragged on, the sun beat down, turning the ground beneath my feet into a furnace. The radio, which had been quiet since last night's strange transmission, crackled to life again. This time, the voice was clearer. Danger. You need to leave. I dropped the wrench I was holding, staring at the radio in disbelief. The voice was faint, distorted, like it was coming from miles away. But it was unmistakable. Someone or something was speaking to me. I snatched up the radio, twisting the dial, trying to find the source. Static. Nothing but static. The voice was gone again, leaving me standing in the middle of the desert, sweat running down my back, my heart hammering in my chest. I should have left then. I should have packed up and driven out of there. But the RV's engine was still stalling, and part of me didn't want to admit that I was spooked. This was why I came out here, wasn't it? To face my fears, to be alone in the dark. I stayed. And that night, the shadows came. The meteor shower was more intense on the second night, the sky alive with fire and light. I sat by the RV, staring up at the heavens, the vastness of the universe overwhelming. But no matter how beautiful the stars were, my eyes kept drifting back to the edges of the desert, where the darkness seemed to pool, thick and impenetrable. It was there, at the far edge of my vision, that I first saw the figure, a shape standing just beyond the reach of my campfire's light. At first, I thought it was a trick of the eye. The desert plays with your perception. Distances blur, shadows stretch. But when I blinked, the figure was still there, standing, watching. I grabbed my camera, adjusting the focus, snapping a shot before the figure disappeared. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, maybe an animal or even another camper who'd wandered too close. But when I checked the camera's screen, my blood went cold. The figure wasn't human. It was tall, too tall, with elongated limbs and a strange, distorted form. It was like a shadow brought to life, a smear of darkness against the starlit sky. The more I stared at it, the more unreal it looked. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I slowly lowered the camera. When I looked again, the figure was gone. The air was suddenly freezing, the kind of cold that bites at your skin. I retreated into the RV, locking the door behind me, my heart racing. I told myself I was imagining things. The desert played tricks on people. I'd read about it, people seeing things that weren't there, hearing voices carried on the wind. But that didn't explain the figure in the photo. The night dragged on, and I stayed awake, listening for anything, any sound, any movement. But all I heard was the persistent hum of the radio and the static, growing louder by the minute. The next day I knew I had to leave. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just my imagination. The figure, the voices, I couldn't explain it, and I didn't want to. I packed up as quickly as I could, but when I turned the key in the ignition, the RV sputtered and died. I tried again and again. Nothing. I stepped out into the desert, sweat pouring down my face. The heat was oppressive, and the silence pressed in on me, suffocating. I tried to call for help, but my phone had no signal and the radio was useless, just a constant garbled stream of static. Then the voice returned, louder than ever. "Stay. Come closer." It wasn't a whisper anymore, it was a command. And when I looked out across the desert, I saw the figure again, closer this time, standing in the distance. Its form was hazy and indistinct, but unmistakable. It was waiting for me. My legs felt like lead as I backed toward the RV, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The air was freezing now, the warmth of the day gone, replaced by a bone-deep chill. I knew in that moment that if I stayed, I would become like the figure, a shadow, a ghost, trapped in this forsaken place, wandering the desert forever. I ran. I don't know how I got the RV started. Maybe it was adrenaline, or maybe sheer panic. But when the engine finally roared to life, I slammed the gas pedal to the floor and didn't look back. The figure, the voice, the cold, they all faded into the distance as I sped across the salt flats, the desert stretching endlessly behind me. I never looked at the photos again. I couldn't. Whatever was out there, it was better left unseen. I'll never return to Black Rock Desert. Some places were meant to be empty. We thought we knew the Ozarks. Matt swore up and down that Mark Twain National Forest was a hidden gem, untouched trails, beautiful vistas, perfect for a 3-day backpacking trip. He was always good at selling these kinds of trips, making it seem like a dream adventure. I believed him mostly because I loved him, but even then, as we parked the car at the trailhead and unloaded our gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that this trip was going to be different. "Looks like we're in for some real wilderness this time," Kyle said, flashing a grin. He was already making jokes about getting lost and being eaten by cryptids. Classic Kyle, always trying to lighten the mood. I laughed it off, but something about the dense trees and the isolation made the joke sit heavy in my chest. The forest felt too quiet, too vast. Matt, as usual, was all business. He was adjusting his pack, double-checking the map on his phone. "We'll follow the GPS for most of the way," he said, his voice filled with confidence. "Should be easy, just a couple of tough climbs, but nothing we can't handle." I glanced at Sarah, who was tightening the straps on her hiking boots. She was always the tough one, competitive, never backing down from a challenge. I liked that about her, but sometimes it felt like she had something to prove, especially when Matt was around. I couldn't tell if it was admiration or rivalry. "Let's get moving," Matt called, waving us on. "We've got a lot of ground to cover." The first day went as expected. We hiked deeper into the forest, leaving behind the marked trails and venturing into the heart of the wilderness. The trees were taller here, their branches heavy with green, creating a canopy that let in only slivers of sunlight. It felt like the forest was swallowing us whole. But Matt pressed on, oblivious to the creeping unease that gnawed at me. That night, we set up camp by a small stream. The air was cooler than I expected, a bite of cold that sank into my bones as the sun set. Kyle's tent had a broken pole, something he hadn't noticed until we tried setting it up. He laughed it off, saying he'd just sleep in Sarah's tent, but Matt's frustration was clear. "Next time, check your gear before we leave," Matt snapped, his voice tight. "Relax, man, it's just a tent pole," Kyle said, but the tension between them simmered. I was too tired to deal with their bickering, so I busied myself with starting the fire. Dana, my girlfriend, snapped photos as always, capturing the last glimmers of daylight filtered through the trees. She looked peaceful behind the camera, but I could tell she felt it too. That sense that something was off. That night, we heard the first howl. It was distant at first, almost like the wind moving through the trees, but then it came again, low and deep, rising into a chilling wail that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "What the hell was that?" Sarah muttered, her hand instinctively moving toward the hatchet strapped to her pack. Matt shrugged, trying to play it off. "Probably just a coyote or something. These woods are full of wildlife." But it didn't sound like any coyote I'd ever heard. I exchanged a glance with Dana, and she raised her eyebrows in that way she did when she didn't believe something. Kyle, of course, took the opportunity to joke. "Sounds like Bigfoot's out there, or maybe the Ozark Howler," he said, his voice teasing. You guys know that one, right? Big hairy creature, glowing red eyes, hunts hikers for fun. Knock it off, Matt said sharply. It's just an animal. Get some sleep. We've got a long hike tomorrow. I tried to brush it off too, but lying in our tent that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig outside made my heart race. I must have drifted off at some point, but it was restless sleep. The next morning, Dana told me she'd seen something outside the tent, just for a second, but she was sure of it. Red eyes. I saw red eyes, Matt, she said softly. I laughed nervously, thinking she must have been half asleep. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, I said, though even I didn't believe it. I hadn't told anyone about the dreams I'd had, the sensation of being watched, hunted, like we were intruding on something that didn't want us there. Day 2 was worse. The forest grew denser, the path less defined, and the GPS signal flickered in and out. At one point, we lost it completely. Matt insisted he could still navigate using the map, but the landscape wasn't matching up with anything. The trees felt wrong, closer somehow, like they were moving in on us. The air grew colder, and the silence pressed down like a weight. We're lost, Sarah said flatly, glaring at Matt. We're not lost, he snapped back. I know where we are. But he didn't. None of us did. That night we found claw marks on the trees, deep gouges, like something had raked through the bark with claws far larger than any animal should have. Dana's hands trembled as she took pictures, but Matt dismissed it. Could be a bear, he said, though the unease in his voice was obvious. That's not a bear, Kyle muttered, his earlier joking tone gone. He stared at the claw marks, his face pale. This is messed up, man. Maybe we should turn back. We're not turning back, Matt said, his voice rising. We've come this far. We stick to the plan. The argument that followed was inevitable. Sarah sided with Kyle, saying we were unprepared and it wasn't worth the risk. Dana stayed quiet, but I could see the fear in her eyes. Matt, stubborn as ever, refused to admit we were in over our heads. We set up camp again that night, and the howling returned. This time it was closer, louder, the sound reverberating through the trees like something was circling us. I barely slept, and when I did, I dreamt of those red eyes watching us from the darkness. In the morning, we found more signs. Animal carcasses torn apart, strewn across the ground. Deer, mostly, their bodies mangled in ways that didn't make sense. No predator would kill like that, not for food. It was like something had ripped them apart for fun. Kyle was the first to voice what we were all thinking. It's the howler, man. I'm telling you, this place is messed up. Matt, as always, refused to believe it. It's just a predator. Wolves, maybe. There are no wolves in the Ozarks, Sarah said, her voice shaking. Not anymore. We kept moving, but the howls followed us, louder, closer. By late afternoon, we knew we weren't alone. We were being hunted. It was just before dusk when we saw it. We stopped to rest, setting our packs down near a small clearing. That's when Dana froze, her camera slipping from her hands. Matt, she whispered, behind you. I turned just in time to see it step out of the trees, hulking, shadowy, with glowing red eyes that burned through the dim light. Its body was massive, covered in thick, dark fur, but its shape was wrong, twisted, like something caught between animal and something more. The howl that followed was like nothing I'd ever heard, a deep, guttural sound that shook me to my core. It didn't charge. It didn't attack. It just stood there, watching, as if daring us to move. We didn't. What the hell is that? Kyle's voice was barely a whisper, his face drained of color. It's not real, Matt muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Dana grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. We have to go, she said, her voice trembling now. The creature tilted its head, almost curious, its red eyes glowing brighter. Then, with one last bone-chilling howl, it slipped back into the trees. We didn't wait to see if it would return. We packed up in record time and started moving fast, too fast. The light was fading, and we were stumbling over roots and rocks, our breath coming in short, panicked gasps. That night we didn't set up camp. We just kept walking, desperate to put distance between us and whatever that thing was. The howls continued, closer, always closer. When dawn finally broke, we stumbled upon an old ranger's cabin. Its roof caved in, The windows shattered. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. We collapsed inside, too exhausted to keep going. For the first time in hours, the howling stopped. Matt stared at the floor, his face pale, his hands shaking. "It's not real," he whispered over and over again, like a broken record. But we knew better. We had heard it, seen it. The Ozark howler was real, and it had let us live, for now. As we sat in that ruined cabin, the forest watching, waiting, I realized we hadn't escaped. Not really. The howler was still out there, somewhere in the shadows, and it was only a matter of time before it came back. I should have known better than to trust an unmarked road. After years of travel writing, you'd think I'd have a sharper instinct for bad decisions, but there I was, driving deeper into Ford Pinchot National Forest, chasing a forgotten trail that was supposed to lead me to a ghost town no one could find anymore, vanished off the map. The ranger at the visitor center had said with a grin, "People go looking for it and never see it again. It's like the road just swallows you up." He laughed, but I could see the glint in his eye. He loved spinning those kinds of tales for tourists, but I wasn't a tourist. I was a writer, damn it. I had an assignment to finish, and there was no room for ghost stories. I followed the narrow, crumbling logging road as it wound deeper into the trees. My RV rattled along, tires crunching over fallen branches and loose gravel. The road narrowed, barely wide enough for my rig, but I kept going. I'd done my research, and this was the right way, even if the forest seemed determined to reclaim the path. It had been a long day, and I was eager to set up camp and relax before exploring the area the next morning. The further I went, the thicker the trees grew, their branches knitting together overhead, blotting out the late afternoon sun. My GPS had long since lost signal, but I didn't need it. I was prepared. I had maps. I was confident I didn't get lost easily. But as I rounded the last bend in the road, something changed. The sky had been clear earlier, but a dense fog was rolling in now, thick and fast. I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. The road, which had been clear just moments ago, seemed to dissolve into a grey blur. I slowed to a crawl, squinting through the windshield. Just up ahead, a small clearing appeared through the mist. It wasn't much, but it was enough room for me to park the RV. I didn't have many other options. I pulled in, killed the engine, and stepped outside. The fog clung to everything, making the air feel damp and cold. It shouldn't have been this cold, not in early fall. The chill crept into my bones, but I pushed it aside and started setting up camp. Something about the silence gnawed at me, though. No wind, no birds, no rustling leaves, just stillness in that damned fog. I finished my setup quickly, then retreated to the warmth of the RV. I wasn't nervous, but the quiet was getting under my skin. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, settled into the driver's seat, and pulled out my maps. I spread them across the dash, looking for my next move. The ghost town was supposed to be less than a mile away, hidden deep in the woods, down a trail that was barely marked. Tomorrow I'd hike to it, get my pictures, take some notes, and be done with it. Easy. But something was off. The road I'd driven on wasn't showing up on the map anymore. I traced the route with my finger, confused. The road was here. I'd just come down it, but now on the map it wasn't anywhere to be found. I leaned back in my seat, staring out the windshield at the fog-shrouded forest. The ranger's words echoed in my mind, vanished off the map. I laughed softly to myself. It was a joke, a tall tale to scare off amateur hikers. Nothing more. Still, when I stepped outside to stretch my legs, I felt it again, that unsettling stillness. The fog was thicker now, curling around the RV like tendrils. I looked back toward the road I'd driven in on, but it wasn't there. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and stepped forward, peering into the mist. No road, just an unbroken line of trees. My stomach tightened. I walked a few more steps, hoping the road would reappear, but it didn't. The forest was dense, the trees close together. There was no sign of the path I had taken just hours earlier. It was as if it had been swallowed whole. I jogged back to the RV, heart racing now. I grabbed my flashlight and marched back to where the road should have been, sweeping the beam through the fog, but all I could see were trees, tall, dark, and oppressive. My breath fogged the air in front of me as I stood there, trying to make sense of it. The road couldn't just vanish. I hadn't gotten lost. I couldn't have. But when I turned back toward the RV, I felt it, that creeping sensation that I wasn't alone. I swung the flashlight around, heart pounding, and for a split second I thought I saw movement in the fog. A figure, tall and thin, slipping between the trees. "Hello?" My voice cracked. I regretted speaking as soon as the word left my mouth. The fog swallowed my voice, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. I scanned the tree line again. Nothing. I backed toward the RV, my nerves on edge, and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I wasn't about to let a little fog and a missing road freak me out, but something felt wrong. The rational part of my brain was trying to make sense of it. Fog could play tricks on your eyes, and maybe I'd missed a turn somewhere. That was all. But deep down, I wasn't convinced. I spent the next hour pacing the length of the RV, checking and rechecking my maps, trying to retrace my route in my head. Nothing made sense. The road had been there. I hadn't imagined it. By nightfall, the fog had thickened to the point where I couldn't see more than a few feet outside. The temperature had dropped even more, and I cranked up the RV's heater, wrapping myself in blankets. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing things, soft thuds like footsteps outside and whispers that seemed to drift through the walls. It had to be the fog, I told myself. It was distorting sound, making me paranoid. But when I woke in the middle of the night, there were voices. I sat up in bed, my breath catching in my throat. I could hear them, faint, murmuring voices, coming from outside. I crawled to the front of the RV, heart hammering, and peered through the windshield. The figures were back. This time there were more of them. Shadows in the fog, standing still, watching. They were too far away to make out any details, but I could feel their eyes on me. Cold, hollow eyes. I blinked, and they were gone. I scrambled to turn on the engine, but it sputtered and died. No power. The RV was silent, cold and dark. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, but the beam barely cut through the fog. I tried to stay calm, tried to think logically, but my heart was racing, my mind spiraling into panic. The road was gone, the figures were back, and now I was trapped here. I had to get out. I grabbed my jacket and burst out of the RV. The cold hit me like a slab. I marched toward where the road had been, determined to find it, but the forest had shifted. The trees were closer now, the fog denser. I walked for what felt like hours, but the landscape stayed the same. It was as if I was walking in circles. No matter which way I turned, I kept ending up back at the RV. I could hear the voices again, closer now. They echoed through the fog, indistinct and ghostly. My flashlight flickered, and the shadows appeared again, closer this time, standing just beyond the beam of light. I ran back to the RV, slamming the door behind me, my chest heaving. The figures were out there, circling me, waiting. I don't know how long I sat there, clutching the flashlight, waiting for something to happen. The fog pressed against the windows, and the shadows loomed outside, never coming closer, but never leaving. Morning came, though I could barely tell. The fog hadn't lifted, and the road was still gone. I tried the engine again, and this time it roared to life. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. I turned the RV around, driving slowly back the way I had come. If the road was there, I couldn't see it. All I could do was follow the same path I'd taken before, hoping it would lead me out. But it didn't. The road stretched out endlessly in front of me, a straight line through the fog, leading nowhere. And as I drove, I realized with sinking dread that I was still trapped. The road hadn't taken me anywhere. I was driving in circles, and the figures were still there, watching, waiting. They had me now. The vanishing road wasn't just a story. It was real, and I wasn't getting out. My name is Kevin Scott, and this all went down in late September 2023. I'm an architect by trade, but my real passion is the great outdoors. Every now and then I take my RV and head to some off-the-beaten-path places. This time, I ended up near a small town in Western Virginia, the locals call Elk Ridge. I didn't think much of the name at the time. I brought along my friend Jimmy Rader. Jimmy's the kind of guy who always has a joke ready, and his upbeat attitude makes him great company. We'd been friends since high school, so it seemed natural to invite him on this little adventure. We were going to meet up with another buddy, Mark Crowley, who lived nearby and knew the area well. We parked the RV at a secluded spot by the forest edge. It was picturesque, the kind of place where the worries of city life melt away. The trees were just beginning to turn colours, and there was a crispness in the air that hinted at the coming winter. The first day was all about setting up camp and catching up over some beers. Mark showed up around midday with a cooler full of venison steaks and some fishing gear. We planned to fish, grill, and maybe hike a bit. Simple stuff, relaxing stuff. The first odd thing happened that night. We'd just finished dinner and were sitting around the fire when we heard something rustling in the woods. At first, we thought it might be a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the sounds were too deliberate, too heavy. Jimmy laughed it off, saying it was probably just our imaginations getting the better of us. Mark seemed a bit uneasy, but he didn't say anything. The next morning, we decided to hike up to an old lookout point Mark had mentioned. It was supposed to offer a spectacular view of the valley. The trail was overgrown, clearly not used much anymore. We reached the lookout around noon, and it didn't disappoint. You could see for miles the forest stretching out in every direction with the distant mountains framing the horizon. On the way back, we found an old abandoned cabin. It was small, maybe a hunting lodge from decades ago. The roof had caved in on one side, and the door hung askew. Mark suggested we take a look inside. Jimmy, always the joker, said we might find treasure. What we found instead was a strange set of carvings on one of the remaining walls. They looked like symbols, maybe Native American or something older. None of us could make heads or tails of it, but it gave me an uneasy feeling. Jimmy snapped a few photos, making jokes about ancient curses, and we headed back to the RV. That night, things took a turn for the worse. We were sitting by the fire again, swapping stories when we heard the same rustling sound from the previous night. This time it was closer. Mark suggested we call it a night and head inside. As we packed up the fire, something crashed through the underbrush nearby. It was big. Whatever it was, we all froze, listening. Jimmy, trying to lighten the mood, shouted, "Hey, Bigfoot, come join the party." There was no response, of course, just more rustling. We hurried into the RV and locked the doors. Inside, we tried to laugh it off, but the tension was palpable. Around midnight, I woke up to a loud banging noise. It sounded like someone or something was trying to get into the RV. I shook Jimmy awake and grabbed the baseball bat I kept under my bed. We crept to the front of the RV where the banging was the loudest. Suddenly, the noise stopped. We waited, holding our breath. Then we heard a low, guttural noise. Not quite an animal growl, but not human nature either. It chilled me to my core. I glanced at Jimmy, his face pale in the dim light. Mark was still asleep, snoring softly in his corner. In the morning, we found deep scratches on the side of the RV, 3 parallel lines gouged into the metal. It wasn't something a bear or any local wildlife could do. Jimmy was visibly shaken, but he tried to play it off with another joke. Mark looked more worried than I'd ever seen him. He suggested we leave, but I convinced them to stay one more night. We were here to relax after all. We'd just be more cautious. We spent the day fishing at a nearby stream. The fish weren't biting much, but it felt good to be out in the open with the sun shining and the fresh air. Jimmy finally seemed to relax, and even Mark loosened up a bit. We returned to the RV with a small catch, just enough for dinner. As the sun set, we made a point of securing everything. We locked the RV doors, bolted the windows, and even set up a makeshift alarm system using some fishing line and empty cans. Jimmy joked that we were turning into survivalists, but I could see the unease in his eyes. That night, we sat inside, playing cards and drinking whiskey. The mood was lighter, almost normal, until we heard it again, the rustling. This time, it was accompanied by a faint, almost rhythmic tapping. Tap, 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 tap. It was coming from the roof. We grabbed our makeshift weapons. Jimmy had a knife, Mark a heavy flashlight, and I had my bat. We cautiously moved to the front of the RV. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. Then it stopped, followed by a loud thud, as if something heavy had jumped off the roof. The next few moments were a blur. The RV rocked violently, and something slammed against the door. We could hear scraping and scratching, the sound of metal bending. Mark shouted for us to brace the door, and we all threw our weight against it. The assault stopped as suddenly as it had begun. We didn't sleep that night. We stayed huddled together, weapons at the ready, listening to the sounds outside. Dawn came slowly, and with it, a decision. We were leaving. This was no longer a vacation. It was a fight for survival. As we packed up, we found more scratches, deeper this time, and what looked like blood smeared near the door. We didn't discuss it. We just moved as quickly as possible. Mark drove, and Jimmy and I kept watch, eyes scanning the forest for any sign of movement. We didn't see anything on the drive back, but the feeling of being watched never left. It was like an invisible weight pressing down on us. We finally reached civilization, and the relief was palpable. We parted ways, each of us eager to put the experience behind us, but it wasn't over. A few days later, I got a call from Mark. Jimmy had gone missing. His family reported that he never made it home. The police found his car abandoned on a back road near the forest. No sign of a struggle, no clues. Just gone. I went back to Elk Ridge with Mark. We retraced our steps, hoping to find some hint of what happened. The forest felt different, darker, as if it was hiding something. We found Jimmy's car, but nothing else. It was like he had vanished into thin air. The police got involved, but there were no leads. Mark and I did our own investigation, talking to locals, searching every inch of the area. We found nothing but those strange symbols again, carved into a tree near where we had camped. They were similar to the ones in the abandoned cabin. Weeks turned into months, and there was still no sign of Jimmy. Mark became obsessed, spending more and more time in the forest. I tried to move on, but the memory of that night haunted me. I started researching local legends, trying to make sense of it all. That's when I came across stories of a creature, something ancient and malevolent, known to the local tribes as ZTH. The descriptions varied, but the common thread was its predatory nature and the way it could vanish without a trace. The symbols we saw were supposedly a warning to stay away from its territory. I don't know what happened to Jimmy, and I doubt I ever will. Mark still goes back to Elk Ridge, searching, hoping for answers. As for me, I've given up camping. The RV is parked in storage, gathering dust. I stick to the city now, where the only predators are human, and the threats more predictable. The memory of that night remains a shadow that lingers at the edge of my thoughts. Sometimes, late at night, I hear that faint rhythmic tapping and wonder if ZTH is still out there, waiting. My name's Kevin Scott, and I've never had much of a conventional career. Growing up in rural Indiana, I was used to hard work. My father taught me to hunt at a young age, not for sport, but because it was necessary for survival. Living off the land became second nature, which I guess is why years later I got recruited by a very quiet branch of the US government. Most people have never heard of us. Those who have might think of us as conspiracy theorists with too much time on our hands. We hunt monsters. This time, they sent me to a place called Willow's Rest in Nebraska. It's a tiny, unremarkable town surrounded by cornfields that stretch for miles. Nothing much different from my own hometown. But something was very wrong here. The locals had reported disappearances, farmers and travelers who had just gone missing, their bodies sometimes found days later, mauled beyond recognition. The local law enforcement called it wild animals, but they knew it wasn't. That's where we came in. I arrived under the cover of being an agricultural inspector. My government ID said I worked for the USDA, but my actual mission was something much darker. They partnered me with a guy named Garrett Moore, who'd been doing this longer than me, but was quieter than a snake in the grass. Garrett didn't talk much about his past, and I didn't pry. We'd been working together for a year and already had an unspoken understanding. Don't ask questions unless it'll save your life. Willow's Rest wasn't any different from dozens of other towns I'd been to for these kinds of jobs. Quiet, polite, but with an underlying tension. The people were scared, though they didn't say it outright. It was in the way they watched the sky, how they didn't walk alone at night, and how they never seemed to talk about the things they'd seen. At first, I thought this might be just another cryptid, a large predator that had slipped into human territory, maybe something along the lines of a Wendigo or a skinwalker. But something felt off. Garrett and I spent a few days setting up surveillance in the cornfields surrounding the town. The corn grew tall, taller than I'd ever seen in Indiana. It reached above my head, swaying in the wind like an endless ocean of green and gold. We kept hearing reports of something large moving through the fields, and occasionally a gutted animal carcass was found near the edges. The locals were jumpy, but no one was talking openly. Something was keeping them quiet. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we set up a base camp on the edge of one of the largest cornfields. The owner, a nervous farmer named Clyde, gave us permission, but wouldn't stay long enough to even discuss what he'd seen. "It's not natural," he muttered before speeding away in his old pickup. Garrett and I exchanged looks. We'd seen plenty of unnatural things, but whatever this was, it had gotten deep into the bones of these people. Night fell fast in those open fields. The sky was huge, stars sprinkled like salt over the black dome above us. We had rifles, tranquilizers, and an arsenal of other tools in case things got ugly. Around midnight, it started. At first, it was subtle, just a rustling in the corn that could have been the wind, but it was too deliberate. Then came the smell, a rancid, decaying stench that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Garrett nodded toward the field, and we both stood, weapons drawn, listening. The rustling grew louder, more erratic. Whatever it was big. I wasn't prepared for what came next. A shadow emerged from the corn, moving on all four paws, but not like any animal I'd ever seen. It was long and gaunt, its limbs grotesquely elongated like a spider's. The skin was grey and mottled, stretched tight over sharp bones that jutted out at odd angles. The head was canine in shape, but the mouth was wide, too wide, lined with rows of uneven teeth that reminded me of a shark. Its back arched unnaturally high, and its eyes, I didn't want to look at them, but I had no choice. They were black, empty, reflecting nothing. The thing moved with impossible speed, tearing through the cornfield toward us. Garrett fired first, a sharp crack splitting the night air. The creature veered fast enough to dodge the shot, but not entirely. It let out a sound somewhere between a scream and a roar, something primal and alien, as the bullet grazed its side. The smell of burning flesh hit my nose, silver bullets as usual. I fired next, aiming for its mass, and this time I hit it dead on. The creature staggered, but instead of dropping, it bolted back into the corn. We pursued, but it was like chasing a shadow through the fields. We lost it within minutes, but not before we stumbled across something far worse. In the clearing there were bodies, or what was left of them. The stench of decay hit us like a punch to the gut. I counted 5, maybe 6 bodies, but it was hard to tell. They were in pieces, torn apart as if something had ripped into them with savage, deliberate force. Limbs were scattered, faces barely recognizable. One poor soul had been gutted, his insides spilling out into the dirt like a grotesque feast. Garrett knelt beside the bodies, his face a stone mask. "This thing's not just killing for food," he said flatly. "It's hunting." We returned to town with what little we had, a few blood samples, a torn piece of flesh from the creature, and our grim report. Clyde didn't ask questions when we told him to leave his farm. The sheriff didn't either when we recommended a full evacuation of the area. They trusted us, or maybe they were just too scared to defy whatever had taken hold of Willow's Rest. 2 nights later, we set up our final stand in the center of the cornfield. We lured the creature with fresh livestock, bound and bleeding, at the edge of the clearing. This time we were ready. Infrared cameras, motion sensors, traps, everything we could muster. The creature came again, as we knew it would. It emerged from the darkness, slower this time, cautious, but we had the upper hand now. As it approached the bait, Garrett hit the trigger, and the trap sprang shut around it. Metal spikes impaled its legs, and it let out that awful scream again, thrashing wildly as we closed in. Up close, the creature was even more horrifying. Its skin was paper-thin, stretched tight over what looked like too many bones. It writhed and snarled as we raised our rifles, silver bullets aimed for its heart. "Let's finish this," Garrett said. We fired in unison. The bullets ripped through the creature's chest, and it collapsed in a heap of twitching limbs. For a moment it lay still, and then its body began to convulse. We stood back, rifles still trained on it, but whatever energy it had left was draining fast. Finally, it stopped moving. I stood over the corpse, breathing hard, waiting for something else to happen. Something worse. But nothing did. The thing was dead, and it wasn't coming back. The next morning, the locals came out of hiding. They didn't ask us questions. They didn't need to. Clyde packed up and left town for good, as did most of the others. Willow's Rest became a ghost town. In the weeks that followed, the fields grew wild and untamed. As for Garrett and me, we moved on to the next job, leaving the body of that thing where it lay. We never figured out what it was. Maybe we never would. All I know is that the cornfields of Willow's Rest were quiet now, too quiet, but that suited me just fine. My name is Ronald Lopez, and this happened to me on a camping trip in the summer of 2020. I was out in the RV with my old college buddy, Sam Driscoll. We decided to take a break from our hectic lives and head out to the Ozarks in Arkansas. Sam and I go way back, and we thought a week away from everything would do us some good. Sam and I had this old RV, a beat-up Winnebago, that we pulled money together for back in our 20s. We've used it for countless trips, but this trip, was different. We arrived at the campsite in the early afternoon. The place was deserted, just the way we liked it. We set up camp, got the fire going, and cracked open a couple of beers. The forest was dense, the trees towering over us, their branches swaying gently in the wind. It was peaceful. After dinner, we sat by the fire, reminiscing about the good old days. Sam mentioned how he hadn't been out camping in years, and how it felt good to be back in nature. I nodded in agreement, the crackling fire casting shadows on our faces. The first night was uneventful. We slept well, the sound of crickets and the occasional owl hooting lulling us to sleep. It was the second night when things started to get strange. We were sitting around the campfire again, talking about nothing in particular, when we heard it, a rustling in the bushes just beyond the light of the fire. I shrugged it off, probably just a raccoon or something, but Sam, he got this look on his face, a look I hadn't seen in a long time. "You hear that, Frank?" he asked, his voice low. "Yeah, probably just some critter," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. But the rustling didn't stop. It grew louder, closer. Sam stood up, grabbing the flashlight from the picnic table. He shined it toward the noise, but we couldn't see anything. "Maybe we should check it out," he said, his eyes darting towards the dark woods. I sighed, not really wanting to leave the warmth of the fire, but agreed. We both grabbed flashlights and headed toward the noise. As we got closer, the rustling stopped. The forest was silent, unnaturally so. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I shook it off. We stood there, flashlights scanning the trees, but there was nothing. "Probably just an animal," I said again, trying to convince myself more than Sam. We headed back to the fire, trying to forget about it, but as the night wore on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I didn't say anything to Sam, but I could tell he felt it too. We decided to turn in early, hoping a good night's sleep would ease our nerves. But sleep didn't come easy. I lay there, staring at the ceiling of the RV, listening to the sounds of the forest. Every little noise made me jump. Around midnight, I heard it again, the rustling. This time it was right outside the RV. I sat up, straining to hear. Sam was already awake, his eyes wide with fear. "You hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, grabbing the baseball bat I kept by the door. We slowly crept towards the front of the RV, trying to be as quiet as possible. I peeked out the window but saw nothing. Then there was a loud bang on the side of the RV. We both jumped, Sam grabbing a kitchen knife. I threw open the door, ready to swing, but there was nothing, just the empty campsite and the dark woods beyond. We stood there for a moment, our breath heavy in the still night air. Then we heard it again, the rustling, but this time it was moving away from us deeper into the woods. "Maybe we should leave," Sam said, his voice shaky. I nodded, but something inside me wanted to know what was out there. I felt this strange compulsion to follow the noise. I grabbed a flashlight and started toward the woods. "Frank, what are you doing?" Sam called after me. "I just want to check it out. I'll be back," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. I walked toward the noise, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The rustling grew louder, and I felt a cold sweat on the back of my neck, but I kept going. I don't know how far I walked, maybe a quarter mile, when I saw it. A figure standing just at the edge of the flashlight's reach. It was tall, hunched over, with long arms that almost touched the ground. I couldn't make out its face, but I knew it was watching me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, just stood there, staring. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I stood there, locked in a silent standoff with this thing. Then it moved, a slow, deliberate step toward me. I took a step back, my flashlight shaking. The figure stopped, then took another step. I turned and ran, not looking back. I burst out of the woods, breathless and terrified. Sam was waiting by the fire, his eyes wide with fear. "What happened?" he asked. But I couldn't speak. I just shook my head, trying to catch my breath. We decided to leave first thing in the morning. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to be around to find out. We packed up quickly, the unease growing with each passing minute. As we were about to get in the RV, we heard it again, the rustling. But this time, it was all around us. I looked around, trying to see where it was coming from, but there was nothing. We jumped in the RV and started the engine. As we pulled away, I saw it again, standing at the edge of the woods, watching us. I didn't say anything to Sam, just kept driving. We didn't talk much on the drive back. The silence was heavy, each of us lost in our own thoughts. When we finally got home, we went our separate ways, promising to stay in touch, but knowing things would never be the same. A few days later, I got a call from Sam's wife. She was frantic, saying Sam had gone missing. He'd gone out to the store and never came back. The police found his car abandoned on a back road, not far from where we had camped. They never found Sam. I still think about that trip, about what we saw out there. I don't know what it was, but I do know one thing. It's still out there, in those woods, waiting, and I'll never go back. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the rustling again. I look out the window, half expecting to see that figure standing there watching. But there's nothing, just the empty night and the memories of a trip that changed everything. Folks around here call it the Watcher. I don't know what it is, but I know it's real, and I know it's dangerous. So if you're ever out in the Ozarks, be careful. You never know what's watching you from the shadows. My name is Jason Shaw, and in 2000 I found myself deep in the uninviting wilderness of the Wrangell St-Elias National Park in Alaska. Being stationed in the country's largest national park might sound impressive, but I can tell you right now there's nothing glamorous about days of combing dense forests and jagged ice-covered slopes in search of people who usually didn't want to be found. But I've got a soft spot for the park. I've been working here for a solid 7 years, and most of the time I wouldn't trade it for anything. Until I got a call from dispatch about an odd case, one that had already rattled the quiet community in McCarthy. 2 hikers, a couple by the name of Jod and Mark O'Connor, had gone missing after setting out for a backcountry trek. They were experienced hikers, the type who meticulously planned every trip, left detailed itineraries, and always checked in on schedule. But this time, they hadn't shown up, and their families were starting to get frantic. Normally I'd write it off as bad luck or poor planning. People tend to underestimate how quickly this wilderness can turn on you. But there was a catch. They hadn't gone alone. They'd been in the company of a local guide, Sawyer Morgan, who was known to everyone in McCarthy. A rough guy, sure, with a dark sense of humor and a reputation for being a bit reckless, but he knew the land better than most. So, when the 3 of them failed to return, and no one had heard a whisper of them for 3 days, it struck a nerve in the tight-knit community. I set out early the next morning, feeling a little more apprehensive than usual. The air was bitter cold, slicing right through the layers I'd bundled up in. My partner for the day was Mike Hargrave, a grizzled vet of the Park Service with a knack for telling off-coloured jokes at the worst possible times. He met me at the trailhead, cracking a grin that told me he was in a better mood than I was. "Jason," he said, "do you ever get the feeling some folks are just begging for trouble? Look at this." He pointed at the tracks leading into the trees, barely visible beneath a fresh dusting of snow. "Now, that ain't normal. You ever known Sawyer to get himself lost?" "No," I replied, trying to shake off the sense of foreboding creeping up on me. I hadn't. Sawyer was a bit of a hotshot, but the man knew his way around this place like it was his own backyard. Something didn't sit right, and as we trudged deeper into the forest, the feeling grew stronger. The trees loomed over us, skeletal and silent, a dense wall of dark green and white that seemed to close in tighter with every step. It was mid-afternoon when we stumbled across the first sign that something was wrong. A scattering of gear. Just a water bottle and a torn backpack strap lay half buried in the snow. Mike picked up the bottle, turning it over in his hands. "Looks like Mark's," he said quietly, and then with his trademark humour creeping in, "Probably a case of a nasty break-up. Nothing like a snowstorm to bring out a couple's issues." I didn't laugh. There was a sharpness to the air, something I couldn't quite place. The snow was falling harder now, making it difficult to see too far ahead. Mike and I pressed on, calling their names, hoping for any kind of response, but the forest swallowed every sound, and the quiet started to feel unnatural. We kept walking until dusk, a steady plodding rhythm that numbed our limbs and frayed our nerves. Just as I was beginning to think we'd have to turn back for the night, I spotted something through the trees. A dark shape, hulking and motionless against the snow, barely discernible in the twilight. At first I thought it was a downed tree, but as we approached the smell hit me, iron-sharp and sickening, and then I saw it, the body of Sawyer Morgan, slumped and frozen, his skin a pale bluish hue against the snow. His jacket was shredded, hanging in tatters around his body and his throat. It looked as though something had torn it open with a single swipe. Mike swore under his breath, taking a step back. "Holy hell," he muttered. "That's not an accident." We circled the scene, examining the snow for tracks, trying to piece together what had happened, but the snow was disturbed, a mess of half-covered footprints and what looked like claw marks gouged into the ground. I'd seen my share of animal attacks, but this was something else. No bear or wolf could do this with such precision, and there wasn't a trace of blood anywhere except on the body. We marked the location and radioed in, telling dispatch we'd found one of the 3 missing hikers, but the response was static, broken up by the worsening storm. It was already getting dark, and with the temperature dropping fast, we knew we didn't have long before the cold would start taking its toll. Just then, we heard it, a faint sound, like something scraping against a tree somewhere close by. Both of us froze, straining our ears, but the noise had stopped as quickly as it had started. Mike whispered, "Alice, tell me you heard that." I nodded, gripping my flashlight a little tighter. The darkness around us seemed to thicken, pressing in from all sides. We moved slowly, inching forward when another sound broke the silence. It was closer this time, almost right beside us, a crunch, as if something heavy was moving through the snow, slowly, deliberately. I raised my flashlight, casting the beam over the trees. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a massive shape standing just beyond the edge of the light, watching. I couldn't make out any details, just the bulk of it, like a bear but wrong. It was hunched, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and there was an unsettling intelligence in the way it moved. Then it lunged toward us. Mike yelled, stumbling back as I aimed my light at the thing, catching a glimpse of claws that looked almost human, elongated fingers tipped with ragged nails. It made a sound, a deep, wet rasp, like it was struggling to breathe, and that was enough to send both of us running. We sprinted through the trees, stumbling over roots and rocks, the sound of its pursuit thundering behind us. I didn't dare look back, too focused on staying ahead of whatever that thing was. I could hear Mike gasping, his footsteps pounding beside mine, and I prayed we'd make it to the trail before it closed the distance. But then, just as we broke through a clearing, I heard him cry out. I turned in time to see him go down, his body dragged back into the shadows as his flashlight flickered and died. His scream was cut short, leaving nothing but silence. I didn't stop. I couldn't. It was survival at that point, pure and simple. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they would give out. When I finally dared to stop, I realized I had no idea where I was. The snow was falling in thick sheets now, covering my tracks and leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. The silence was oppressive, the forest unnaturally still. I crouched down, catching my breath, my mind racing as I tried to figure out my next move. That's when I heard it again, that scraping sound, soft and deliberate, coming from somewhere close. I ducked behind a tree, my heart pounding as I fumbled for my radio. I whispered into it, hoping for some miracle that it would pick up a signal, but all I got was static. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The creature stood at the edge of the trees, its head tilted as if studying me. Now that I could see it more clearly, I felt a wave of nausea. It had the body of a predator, lean and muscular, but its skin was stretched too tightly over its bones, giving it a twisted, almost human look. Its mouth was too wide, filled with rows of teeth that looked like they belonged to a shark, and those hands, long, bony fingers that flexed and curled as it watched me. I took a step back, my mind racing through my options, which weren't many. I didn't have a weapon, not even a pocket knife. Running seemed like a death sentence, but staying put wasn't much better. The creature took a step forward, its gaze fixed on me, and I knew I had to make a choice. In a desperate move, I turned and bolted, weaving between the trees, trying to lose it in the dense forest. The thing let out a guttural hiss, and I heard it crashing through the underbrush behind me. My legs felt like lead, each step heavier than the last, but I pushed forward, ignoring the burning in my lungs. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I stumbled out of the forest and into a clearing, my chest heaving as I collapsed onto the ground. The storm had worsened, the snow blinding, and I realized I'd somehow circled back to where we'd found Sawyer's body, except now there were two bodies. Mike lay sprawled in the snow, his body twisted at an unnatural angle, his face frozen in a look of sheer terror. I staggered to my feet, my mind reeling. The thing had dragged him back here, left him as a warning, or maybe just for sport. I didn't want to stick around to find out which. I turned and stumbled through the snow, the cold seeping into my bones, numbing my fingers and toes. I kept moving, driven by pure instinct, not daring to look back. I could still feel it, somewhere in the darkness, following me, relentless and patient, its presence like a shadow pressing in around me. When I finally made it back to the edge of the forest, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. I collapsed onto the ground, the snow biting into my skin, but I didn't care. I was alive, and that was enough.